It began in silence. No battlefields, no tanks, no bombs. Just a stretch of forest, a dirt road, and the sound of boots crunching over frost. A line of people, mothers clutching their children, old men too weak to walk, soldiers barking orders. They were told they were being relocated. But what waited wasn't a train. It was a pit. Within minutes, the forest erupted in gunfire. When it stopped, the world was quieter than it had ever been. This was not a war in the usual sense. It was something darker, something built on paperwork, ideology, and blind obedience. These men didn't fight enemies. They hunted civilians. They called themselves special task forces. History calls them the Einsatzgruppen. And before the gas chambers, before the camps became industrialized death, it was these squads who showed the world how mass murder could be organized, scheduled, and justified. They killed not in anger, but in order. They wrote reports about it, filed them neatly, and moved on to the next town. Somewhere in those fields, in those forests, in those bullet casings buried under decades of soil, lies the truth about how ordinary men became architects of the unimaginable. Tonight, we're going to uncover it. Not as a list of atrocities, but as a story of how evil learned to operate efficiently. This is not just history. This is the moment humanity looked into the mirror and saw what it was capable of. Chapter 1: Shadows Before the Storm. Berlin, 1933. Smoke rises from the Reichstag as the sky burns red above a city on edge. The smell of wet stone and charred timber hangs in the air. In the chaos, a man stands at a window inside the chancellery, watching his reflection disappear into the glass. His name is Adolf Hitler, and in his silence lies the storm that would engulf the world. Outside, torches flicker through the streets like veins of fire. Inside, ideas are being sharpened into weapons. Germany is still bruised from the humiliation of the First World War. Millions live in poverty, their savings erased by inflation, their pride crushed by defeat. The Weimar Republic, fragile, democratic, and despised, is collapsing under the weight of despair. People want someone to blame, and Hitler gives them one. He tells them their suffering was not the fault of war or bad politics, but of an invisible enemy: Jews, communists, foreigners. The poison spreads easily because it feeds on pain. From his prison cell in 1924, Hitler had written Mein Kampf. It was not just a book, it was a manifesto, a roadmap for revenge disguised as salvation. In its pages, he promised to rebuild Germany into a nation of purity and power. He spoke of racial hygiene, a chilling phrase that would one day justify mass murder. He wrote that Jews were parasites, corrupting the blood of the nation. Most dismissed it as mad rambling. Few understood that the words would become policy. By the time Hitler takes power, those words are treated like scripture. His followers chant them in rallies. Teachers whisper them in classrooms. A new Germany begins to form, built not on freedom, but on obedience. The National Socialist dream is one of order and purity, and in that dream, there is no room for mercy. Newspapers print caricatures of Jews as rats or snakes. Films like The Eternal Jew drip with hatred, teaching even children that some lives are not worth living. The radio crackles with speeches about the enemy within, filling living rooms with the rhythm of fanaticism. The danger of propaganda lies not in how loudly it screams, but in how quietly it seeps. By 1935, the Nuremberg laws have divided society in black and white. Jews can no longer marry Germans, hold government jobs, or even raise the German flag. They are erased from citizenship, stripped of dignity one regulation at a time. To the public, it feels like order returning. To the victims, it feels like the walls closing in. Inside the SS headquarters, another transformation is underway. Heinrich Himmler, meticulous and soft-spoken, turns the Schutzstaffel, the protection squad, into something far more than bodyguards. He imagines an elite order, bound by racial purity and absolute loyalty. He speaks of them as soldiers of ideology, men who kill not out of anger, but conviction. Under him, the SS becomes a state within a state. Its own laws, its own courts, its own religion of blood. Reinhard Heydrich, sharp-faced and cold-eyed, enters the story here. A failed naval officer turned bureaucrat of death. He builds the Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, the Nazi intelligence service. Heydrich's gift is organization. He collects data, tracks people, builds files. To him, humanity is a ledger of names and categories. The SD becomes the brain behind the terror, identifying who must be eliminated to make the nation pure. It is the prelude to something unimaginable. Ordinary Germans learn to look away. Some genuinely believe the propaganda. Others convince themselves they have no choice. The smell of fear becomes part of daily life. Neighbors vanish overnight, their apartments sealed and silent. In the morning, people sweep the dust off the doorstep and pretend nothing happened. Silence is safer than questions. In a society where everyone listens, trust becomes a liability. The regime's obsession with purity extends beyond people. Himmler begins to speak of the SS as a breeding order, as if he were cultivating a race of gods. Men are measured by skull shape, bloodline, and even the color of their eyes. Women are selected to bear racially valuable children. What began as political fanaticism turns into biological religion. In this warped vision, extermination becomes not cruelty, but duty. By the late 1930s, the machinery of hate is working smoothly. Nazi rallies choreographed like theater performances fill the air with chants of Einvolk, Ein Reich, Ein Führer. The sound of marching boots echoes through the streets of Nuremberg and Munich. The smell of oil lamps and gunmetal mixes with the thunder of drums. The people are not just spectators. They are participants in a new reality. When millions cheer the Führer, the few who doubt him are drowned out. The SS, meanwhile, expands its reach. It takes over the police, intelligence, and military security. The Gestapo, the secret state police, begins rounding up political enemies, communists, and anyone deemed undesirable. Prisons overflow, and concentration camps like Dachau become laboratories of control, where cruelty is tested, refined, and perfected. Every beating, every experiment, every order becomes a rehearsal for something larger. In quiet offices, bureaucrats learn to describe murder with the language of administration. Special measures, evacuation, final solution. Each phrase is a mask. Behind every euphemism lies a grave. But no one questions the wording. Paperwork keeps hands clean, even when the ink runs black with blood. As Hitler looks eastward, his mind turns to conquest. The Soviet Union, vast and filled with what he calls inferior races, becomes his next obsession. To him, the war in the East will not be like France or Poland. It will be a war of extermination. He tells his generals that the fight against Bolshevism is also a fight against the Jews, for in his delusion, the two are one and the same. Every soldier who marches into the East will carry not just a rifle, but an ideology. The seeds of the Einsatzgruppen are already germinating. They do not yet exist in name, but their idea lives, in the files of the SS, in the speeches of Himmler, in the cold precision of Heydrich's planning. The concept is simple. Mobile units of police and SS officers will follow the army, cleanse the conquered lands, and eliminate enemies of the Reich. On paper, they are security forces. In reality, they are executioners waiting for orders. For the men who will one day fill their ranks, the transformation begins quietly. A police captain receives a letter transferring him to a new, special unit. A teacher joins the SS Reserve, believing he's serving his country. A lawyer takes a post in the SD because it pays better. Each one steps a little closer to the abyss, never realizing what waits at the end. Inside classrooms, young students learn racial science. They are taught to measure skulls, to calculate blood percentage, to see people not as individuals but as numbers. Children grow up believing compassion is weakness. When the time comes to kill, they will not see human beings. They will see categories. Even culture bends to ideology. Painters are forbidden to depict sorrow or doubt. Musicians are told to write marches, not requiems. Books are burned in public squares as crowds cheer. The air smells of ash and cheap gasoline. Every symbol of conscience is erased, replaced with the swastika. The goal is not just to control behavior, but to rewire the soul. By 1939, Europe trembles once more. Germany has swallowed Austria, dismantled Czechoslovakia, and set its eyes on Poland. Soldiers polish their boots, tanks line the borders, and the whisper of invasion rides the wind. In the shadows, Heydrich finalizes his plans. He gathers his officers and speaks of a new kind of war, a war without mercy, where politics and morality no longer apply. His words are cold, logical, terrifyingly calm. He tells them this is about survival, about purifying Europe. No one dares to ask what that means. When German troops cross into Poland, the world witnesses the first acts of systematic killing. The SS and police battalions move behind the army, targeting Jews, intellectuals, priests, anyone who might resist. Villages are emptied, bodies buried in shallow graves. These are the dress rehearsals, the first sparks of what will become the Holocaust. The Einsatzgruppen are not yet named, but their work has begun. What makes it possible is not just the orders, but the belief that this is right. Soldiers write letters home about cleansing operations, as if they were describing farm work. They see themselves as instruments of destiny, not murderers. The true weapon is not the rifle. It's the idea that the victims deserve it. Night after night, in dimly lit offices, Heydrich and Himmler refine their plans. They talk about efficiency, coordination, logistics. They do not talk about guilt. They discuss numbers, quotas, and transport schedules. The conversation sounds like business management until you realize the inventory is human life. And all across Germany, life goes on. People go to work, children attend school, families listen to the radio. The music plays, the streets are clean, the trains run on time. On the surface, it is civilization. Underneath, it is rot. The silence of millions becomes the foundation upon which murder will be built. As the decade ends, Europe stands on the edge of catastrophe. The machine is assembled. The men are trained. The ideology is law. All that remains is to unleash it. The forests of the East wait silently, unaware that they will soon echo with gunfire. The rivers that now reflect moonlight will soon run dark with something else. The storm is not yet broken, but the air is heavy with it. In offices lit by flickering lamps, signatures are still drying on papers that will condemn millions. The men who sign them believe they are building a new world. What they're really building is a grave. And somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of marching grows louder, steady, mechanical, unstoppable. The shadows have already begun to move. Chapter 2: Birth of the SS and the Seeds of Murder. It started with an oath. A few hundred men in black uniforms stood in a dimly lit hall, the flicker of torches dancing across their faces. Their voices rose in unison, cold and absolute. Loyalty to the Führer, obedience unto death. The air smelled of smoke and polish, of leather and fear. They were not soldiers of war, at least not yet. They were soldiers of belief, of ideology. They were the Schutzstaffel, the SS, and in the years to come, they would evolve from bodyguards into architects of mass murder. The early SS was small, almost ceremonial, formed in the mid-1920s as a personal guard for Adolf Hitler. They wore black not just for intimidation, but as a symbol of death, of purity, of separation from the world they swore to dominate. Their leader at first was a former cavalry officer named Julius Schreck, later replaced by others with even sharper edges. But the man who would truly shape the SS was Heinrich Himmler, a man not of brute strength or charisma, but of chilling precision. Himmler was not a soldier. He was an intellectual bureaucrat, a dreamer of dark fantasies. He believed history was a struggle between races, that Germany's destiny was written in blood and purity. To him, the SS was more than a police force. It was a holy order, a modern knightly class tasked with cleansing the earth. When he took command in 1929, the SS numbered less than 300 men. Within a decade, it would grow into an empire within an empire, an organization of hundreds of thousands, loyal only to him and to Hitler. Himmler's vision was meticulous. Every SS man was to be selected not merely for skill, but for ancestry. Family lineage had to be traced back centuries to ensure Aryan purity. Marriages required approval. Children born to SS families were seen as national assets. What began as racial theory soon hardened into administrative reality. Bureaucracy became ideology, and ideology became action. The SS motto, "My honor is loyalty," wasn't just words. It was a creed that dissolved individuality. Once sworn in, a man ceased to belong to himself. His conscience, his morality, even his thoughts were no longer private property. They belonged to the Reich. Obedience became virtue. Questioning became treason. It was this psychological transformation, this surrender of the self, that would make the atrocities of the future possible. Himmler's obsession with control led him to create layers within the SS. Beneath the polished black uniforms and skull insignia was a network of intelligence, police, and administrative power. At its core stood the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, or Security Service, led by Reinhard Heydrich, a man who would come to embody the lethal efficiency of the Nazi system. Heydrich was everything Himmler admired: disciplined, cold, and ruthless. A failed naval officer turned master bureaucrat. He combined charm and cruelty with mechanical precision. He could play the violin beautifully, then sign an order for mass arrest without hesitation. To him, murder was logistics. His SD became the eyes and ears of the regime, cataloging enemies, infiltrating resistance movements, and building the information infrastructure that would one day direct genocide. By the early 1930s, the SS began to devour other institutions. When the Nazis consolidated power in 1933, the SA, the brown-shirt street thugs who had helped Hitler rise, became a liability. Their unruly violence threatened to destabilize the new regime. Hitler turned to Himmler and Heydrich for a solution. And on a warm June night in 1934, the solution arrived in the form of gunfire. The Night of the Long Knives was a purge disguised as patriotism. Under orders from Hitler, SS units stormed hotels, homes, and safe houses across Germany. Ernst Röhm, leader of the SA, was arrested and executed. So were hundreds of others, political opponents, inconvenient allies, anyone suspected of disloyalty. The sound of gunshots echoed across the country like a grim oath being renewed. By morning, the SS had proved its loyalty in blood. It was no longer just a guard. It was the regime's sword. The German army took note. Many officers despised the SS as upstarts, yet even they saw its power growing. Himmler's men now had authority over internal security, intelligence, and policing. They wore the skull insignia not just as intimidation, but as a promise that they would serve death if ordered to. Within a year, Himmler had control of the Gestapo, the secret police. The merger of ideology and surveillance was complete. Life in the SS was designed to strip away doubt. Training was psychological indoctrination, disguised as discipline. Recruits learned not just to obey, but to believe. They were told that mercy was weakness, that racial enemies were parasites, that pity endangered the nation. Exercises were brutal. Sleep was scarce. Those who broke down were discarded. Those who adapted became perfect instruments, calm, efficient, unquestioning. The uniforms themselves were symbols of this transformation. Black, perfectly tailored, immaculate. Each piece was meant to erase humanity and replace it with authority. The insignia gleamed under light, skulls and runes signifying loyalty to death and destiny. When an SS officer entered a room, silence followed, not out of respect, but out of fear. It was psychological warfare in fabric and metal. By 1936, Himmler's empire extended beyond imagination. He now controlled not only the Gestapo and SD, but also the concentration camp system. What had begun with Dachau as a detention center for political prisoners became a vast network of terror. Camps were not yet death factories, but laboratories, places to test obedience, refine cruelty, and perfect the art of dehumanization. Guards learned to treat prisoners as subhuman, to kill without hesitation, to separate emotion from duty. In these camps, the boundaries of morality began to dissolve. Prisoners were beaten, starved, worked to death, or used in experiments. Orders were followed precisely, reports written neatly, discipline maintained. There was no chaos, only procedure. Murder became a matter of paperwork. This was the SS' true innovation, the industrialization of evil through organization. While Himmler envisioned the SS as an order of racial purity, Heydrich turned it into a machine of surveillance. The SD compiled vast lists of enemies of the state: Jews, communists, homosexuals, intellectuals, priests. Everyone was categorized, numbered, cross-referenced. It was data-driven hatred, decades before computers. Each file was a death sentence waiting for its moment. Outside Germany, the world still believed the regime was simply rebuilding. The Olympics of 1936 showed a nation polished and proud. Smiling athletes, waving flags, a sense of order. The camera never turned toward the camps. The visitors never saw the lists being compiled in the shadows. The world saw peace. Germany prepared for war. As Europe drifted toward conflict, Himmler began forming the Waffen-SS, armed divisions that would fight alongside the regular army, but remain politically loyal to the Nazi Party. These men were not traditional soldiers. They were ideologues with weapons, trained to see war as racial cleansing. They carried both rifles and doctrine. The lines between combat and execution blurred. Meanwhile, inside the SS administration, a chilling question began to take shape. What should be done with the millions of Jews in Europe once conquest began? The question was never about coexistence, only method. To the bureaucrats of death, genocide was a technical problem to be solved. Every meeting, every memo, every calculation brought the answer closer. Among the lower ranks, doubts still flickered. Some men struggled with the violence, the sight of prisoners beaten or killed. But Himmler had no tolerance for hesitation. He told his officers that compassion was the enemy of efficiency. He promised them glory in history if they silenced their hearts. Many obeyed. Those who didn't were replaced. The SS was built on duality, polished on the surface, monstrous beneath. Officers attended concerts, wrote letters home, loved their families. Then, by day, they orchestrated murder. The human mind, stretched between affection and atrocity, began to normalize both. It was this normalization, the ability to kill and then dine peacefully, that would define the men who later commanded the Einsatzgruppen. The culture of the SS was self-reinforcing. Every promotion, every medal, every ceremony rewarded cruelty disguised as strength. Himmler often spoke to his officers about hardness, a word that became sacred. To be hard was to be loyal, to be pure, to be beyond morality. He told them that one day, history would understand their sacrifices, that they were doing difficult but necessary work. He never said the word murder. He didn't need to. As the 1930s closed, the SS had woven itself into every part of German life. It controlled the police, the intelligence, the camps, even parts of the economy. It had its own schools, its own industries, its own myths. It was a state within the state, answerable only to Himmler and Hitler. To outsiders, it appeared invincible. To insiders, it was a cage. Once inside, no one could leave without disappearing. The war gave the SS its opportunity. When the Wehrmacht invaded Poland in September 1939, SS units followed closely behind. Their task was security. In reality, it was annihilation. They targeted Jewish communities, Polish intellectuals, priests, and anyone considered subversive. The killings were methodical, rehearsed. Villages burned, fields filled with graves. For many of these men, it was their first taste of blood. For the SS leadership, it was proof of concept. The brutality shocked even some army officers, but complaints were ignored. Hitler and Himmler saw success, not horror. The SS had shown that it could execute mass murder with discipline and order. The lesson was clear. If killing could be systematized, it could be expanded. The seeds of the Einsatzgruppen had sprouted. In the winter of 1939, in the aftermath of Poland's fall, Himmler and Heydrich met privately to discuss the future. The war in the East was already being planned. They spoke of racial reorganization, of security measures, of special actions. The language was sterile, but the meaning was unmistakable. They were preparing for the next phase, where ideology would merge fully with extermination. Outside, snow fell quietly over Berlin. The city glowed faintly under blackout curtains. Somewhere in the night, a typewriter clacked, recording names on a list. Somewhere else, a train whistle cut through the cold air, its sound carrying across the rooftops. The machinery of death was already humming beneath the surface, invisible yet unstoppable. For the SS men who would one day lead the mobile death squads, their paths were being forged. Training intensified. Political indoctrination deepened. Their orders were no longer just about control. They were about cleansing. When the invasion of the Soviet Union came, they would be ready. Their targets would no longer be individuals, but entire populations. In those final months before Barbarossa, Himmler toured the camps and spoke to his men with chilling calm. He told them they must be strong enough to kill thousands and still sleep peacefully. He told them their actions would save Germany for 1,000 years. Many believed him. Those who didn't stayed silent. The transformation was complete. The SS had become the embodiment of Nazi ideology, efficient, fanatical, merciless. What began as a handful of guards sworn to protect one man had evolved into a vast organization prepared to cleanse continents. Its leaders no longer saw blood as a stain, but as proof of devotion. And in the East, beyond the forests and the rivers, millions of lives waited unknowingly in the path of that devotion. The future murderers already wore their uniforms. The orders were already drafted. The ideology was already law. All that remained was for the war to begin. The torches that once flickered in dark halls now burned brighter, reflected in the steel of helmets and the glass of train windows heading toward Poland. The echo of those early oaths, the promise of loyalty unto death, still lingered in the air. And soon, that promise would be fulfilled in ways the world had never imagined. The SS had found its purpose. The seeds had been planted. And as the storm gathered over Europe, those seeds began to grow, not into soldiers of honor, but into the mobile death squads that would stain history forever. Chapter 3. The Road to War. The night before the invasion of Poland, the air across the German border was thick with mist and quiet expectation. In the forests near Gleiwitz, men in SS uniforms whispered in the dark, preparing for an operation that would ignite the world. They were staging a fake attack, a false flag meant to justify the invasion. Dead bodies, dressed in Polish uniforms, were arranged like props on a stage. Photographs would be taken, reports would be written, and by morning, Hitler would claim that Germany had been attacked. The world would hear lies, but the guns would speak the truth. At dawn on September 1st, 1939, German tanks rolled across the border. The Second World War had begun, and behind those tanks, following closely in their shadow, came the first waves of organized murderers, the prototypes of what would soon be known as the Einsatzgruppen. To most of the world, the invasion of Poland was a war of conquest, but to Hitler and his inner circle, it was something far more ideological. It was the opening move in a campaign to reshape Europe according to racial hierarchy. In their minds, Poland was not just a nation, it was a laboratory, a place where they could test the theories of racial domination they had been preaching for years. When the Wehrmacht moved in, the SS followed, their orders precise yet horrifyingly vague. Eliminate anyone who might resist, and cleanse the land of inferior elements. It was a euphemism that would soon become synonymous with death. The war in Poland was quick, brutal, and merciless. German bombers tore through the skies, turning towns into ash. Civilians flooded the roads, their carts filled with whatever fragments of life they could carry. Soldiers shouted, fires burned, and the air was filled with the acrid scent of oil and fear. In the chaos, the SS and police units moved with purpose. They were not chasing armies. They were hunting people. Teachers, priests, doctors, intellectuals. Anyone capable of shaping Polish identity was marked for execution. The plan was simple: destroy the nation by killing its mind. These operations were not spontaneous acts of rage. They were carefully organized, documented, and reported. Heydrich called it the intelligentsia action. It was a rehearsal for something far greater. In towns like Bydgoszcz and Tarnia, prisoners were rounded up, marched to the outskirts, and shot in pits dug by their own hands. The sound of gunfire echoed across the fields, sharp and mechanical. Villagers watched from afar, their breath held, their faith shattered. The perpetrators were calm, professional, detached. To them, it was duty. In Berlin, reports from the field arrived on Himmler's desk like progress updates. Each file listed names, numbers, and locations. The language was bureaucratic, almost sterile. Security operations completed. Enemies neutralized. Population pacified. Every sentence masked a massacre. The machine of murder was learning to function efficiently. But even in its early stages, the violence was not confined to elites or political figures. Jews were singled out from the beginning. Synagogues were burned, businesses looted, families dragged from their homes. In the ghettos of Warsaw, Lodz, and Krakow, people were forced to wear armbands marked with the Star of David. They were herded into sealed neighborhoods, cut off from food and medicine, watched by guards with rifles. Diseases spread, hunger gnawed, and despair settled like dust. The Jews were being isolated, not only physically, but psychologically, preparing both the victims and the killers for what was to come. The SS called these operations cleansing actions. The euphemism hid the truth, that they were building a system in which human life could be classified, managed, and erased. Each killing became a line item, each victim a number. The perpetrators filled out forms after executions, detailing how many rounds had been fired, how many bodies disposed of. Efficiency became morality. Murder became a task to be perfected. Amid this, Reinhard Heydrich watched closely. He saw Poland as the testing ground for his administrative genius. His goal was to coordinate every branch of the SS, police, and army into one seamless mechanism of control. He created the Reich Security Main Office, the RSHA, to merge intelligence, policing, and ideological enforcement. It was the brain of the Nazi terror state. Under Heydrich's direction, the structure of systematic extermination began to take shape long before the gas chambers were conceived. The Einsatzgruppen would soon become its sharpest instrument. But in 1939, these units were still evolving. They were not yet called Einsatzgruppen, but they already operated under the same principles. They followed behind the army, ensuring that no opposition survived. They gathered information, conducted executions, and spread terror. Each group worked closely with the local Gestapo and Wehrmacht commanders, blurring the line between military operation and genocide. In towns like Pabinica and Włocławek, SS officers stood over pits filled with bodies and took photographs, for documentation, for pride, sometimes even for souvenirs. The horror was methodical, but it was also personal. The soldiers who participated often wrote home. Their letters spoke of difficult tasks and special actions. They rarely mentioned the word killing, but the truth bled through the gaps. Some expressed pride, others unease. One policeman wrote that he couldn't stop hearing the screams of women and children at night, that they followed him into his dreams. Another described the execution of entire families as if recounting a work assignment, cold, procedural, without emotion. The line between horror and habit blurred with each passing day. For Himmler, this was the beginning of a new kind of war. He called it the war of extermination. To him, Traditional rules of conflict no longer applied. The enemy was not just armies, it was entire populations. Jews, Roma, intellectuals, communists, anyone who did not fit the Nazi racial ideal. The SS viewed this not as cruelty, but as biological necessity. They were cleansing the future. The soldiers in the field were the scalpel. Himmler was the surgeon. In October, Hitler stood before his generals and spoke with cold certainty. He told them that victory required brutality. "The stronger man is right," he said. "The goal is not to spare the enemy, but to destroy him." His words rippled down the chain of command, legitimizing everything that followed. With the Führer's blessing, the threshold of violence vanished. The army, the police, and the SS began to operate in moral unison, each reinforcing the other's crimes. Poland fell quickly. By the end of the month, Warsaw lay in ruins, and the country was divided between Germany and the Soviet Union. But the conquest was only the beginning. In the new German-occupied territories, Nazi administrators began implementing racial policies on a massive scale. Millions of Poles were displaced from their homes to make room for German settlers. Villages were emptied, churches looted, cemeteries desecrated. The land itself was being rewritten, geographically, demographically, spiritually. The SS established special units to manage this reordering, called the RKFDV, the Reich Commission for the Strengthening of Germandom. Its mission was to Germanize the East by removing undesirable populations. It sounded administrative, but in practice it meant forced deportation, enslavement, and death. Children with Aryan features were taken from Polish families and sent to be raised as Germans. Others were shot on the spot. The concept of humanity dissolved into a hierarchy of worthiness. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Heydrich was refining the model for total control. The Polish campaign had revealed flaws, disorganization, lack of coordination, inefficient reporting. He saw an opportunity to perfect the system. When Germany turned its eyes toward the Soviet Union, Heydrich vowed it would be different. The next campaign would be executed with mathematical precision. The Einsatzgruppen would be officially formed, mobile killing units designed not just for occupation, but for annihilation. But even as the machinery of genocide evolved, traces of conscience flickered in unexpected places. Some Wehrmacht officers were disturbed by the SS brutality. They protested, arguing that indiscriminate killing would undermine discipline. Yet their complaints were not moral objections. They were practical concerns. They feared chaos, not sin. And when Hitler reminded them that the Eastern War would be a war of races, not soldiers, the protests ended. The chain of obedience held firm. Among the Polish people, resistance began to stir, even as the walls closed in. Underground newspapers circulated, secret schools operated in basements, priests whispered sermons of defiance. The human spirit, cornered and bleeding, refused to vanish. But the cost was immense. For every act of defiance, entire families were executed in reprisal. The SS made examples of anyone who dared to fight back. Streets that once echoed with laughter now carried the sound of boots and gunfire. As the months passed, the ghettos swelled. Thousands died of hunger before a single bullet was fired. The guards grew indifferent. The corpses piled up. Disease became a weapon of its own. Himmler's reports described these conditions as natural selection. He spoke of it as cleansing by nature, as though death itself had become par policy. The moral corruption was complete. When winter came, the snow covered the fields where the bodies lay buried. But nothing could conceal the truth from those who had seen it. German soldiers joked about Jew hunts. SS photographers cataloged their crimes as if they were documenting progress. And deep within the SS archives, a new term began to circulate: final solution. It was not yet official, but it was coming. The idea had taken root, nourished by the blood of Poland. In early 1940, as the campaign ended, the veterans of these killing operations were rewarded. Promotions, medals, and commendations were handed out. Efficiency was praised, initiative rewarded. Heydrich noted which officers had shown exceptional firmness, and earmarked them for future Einsatzgruppen commands. Men who had overseen the slaughter of civilians would soon be leading mobile death squads across the Soviet frontier. The Polish campaign had created the blueprint. Now it was time to expand it. In private, Himmler admitted to a close aide that Poland had taught him something. People can be trained to kill, he said. At first, they resist. But after repetition, it becomes mechanical. He understood the psychology of murder better than most. The SS was not just killing people. It was transforming its own men into instruments. By severing empathy, by wrapping violence in duty, he had discovered how to mass-produce killers. And in that discovery lay the foundation for everything that followed. The Einsatzgruppen would not emerge from chaos, but from organization, from ideology wedded to administration. When the time came to invade the Soviet Union, these units would not need persuasion. They would already know their purpose. They had rehearsed it in the towns and forests of Poland, where the earth still whispered with the memory of the dead. By the summer of 1940, Europe was collapsing under German dominance. France had fallen, the Low Countries were occupied, and Britain stood alone across the Channel. Yet even as the world watched the bombs fall over London, another kind of war was being prepared. One that would not be fought with tanks or planes, but with rifles, pistols, and shovels. A war against unarmed men, women, and children. A war that would redefine what evil meant. In Berlin, maps of the East covered entire walls. Arrows pointed toward the Soviet Union, each line representing a future killing field. Heydrich's staff worked late into the night, drafting orders, assembling names, refining logistics. The Einsatzgruppen would follow the army's advance, cleaning the conquered territories of undesirable elements. Their mission would be absolute. No negotiations, no mercy. Only the methodical destruction of life. The road to war had become the road to genocide. The lessons of Poland, the efficiency of murder, the normalization of atrocity, the merging of ideology with bureaucracy, had set the course. And when the invasion of the Soviet Union began in 1941, the world would witness the full consequence of that evolution. For now, though, Europe lay silent beneath the storm clouds. Soldiers trained, weapons gleamed, and orders waited in drawers. The men who had killed in Poland drank and laughed, not knowing, or perhaps not caring, that they had already crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Somewhere on the border, an officer looked east and saw only opportunity. Another saw a graveyard. Both were right. The war that was coming would not just conquer land, it would devour souls. And the men who had learned to kill efficiently in Poland were ready to do it again. This time on a scale the world had never imagined. The engines were already warming. The files were prepared. The commanders were waiting. The road to war had been paved not with strategy, but with corpses. And soon, it would stretch all the way to the heart of the Soviet Union, where the Einsatzgruppen would begin their true work. Chapter 4. Planning the War of Annihilation. He kept his cigar untouched, the ember glowing like a distant sun behind the frosted window. In the dim light of a cramped study, a map of the Soviet Union lay spread across a table, rivers traced in ink, cities circled in red. Adolf Hitler traced a finger along the lines, as though drawing a future in blood. Around him sat men in starched uniforms and stiff collars, generals, policemen, and the architects of terror. The room smelled of tobacco, pipe smoke, and paper. No one laughed. The conversation was clinical. It was not about borders alone. It was about people, how to move them, contain them, or remove them. This was not simply a war for land. This was planned as a war to erase. From the beginning, the rhetoric changed the reality. When Hitler spoke of Lebensraum, he invoked an image of living space, fertile soil for the German people. But wrapped inside that phrase was a calculus of exclusion, the removal of those who already lived there. To the Nazi leadership, geography and biology merged. The East was not simply occupied territory. It was a reservoir of racially inferior people whose presence threatened the purity of the Reich. In quiet offices and grand halls, Men who wore medals practiced the language of annihilation and made it bureaucratic. The resulting plan would be precise, monstrous, and disturbingly modern. The decision to invade the Soviet Union had military aims: crush Bolshevism, secure raw materials, and neutralize a powerful adversary. But it also had an ideological overlay that transformed this campaign into a different kind of war. It was a war of ideology as much as of force. Hitler and Himmler spoke openly of a conflict against what they called Judeo-Bolshevism, conflating political systems and ethnic identity in a toxic equation. To them, defeating communism required more than victory in battle. It required the removal of the social and racial elements they believed had brought communism into existence. The soldiers who marched east would carry doctrine as well as rifles. Inside this stew of paranoia and planning, Heinrich Himmler took a particular interest. He moved like a man assembling a machine, precise and relentless. Himmler's office was a laboratory of control, files stacked like bricks, registers of ancestry, dossiers of suspects. He envisioned the SS not simply as guards of the regime, but as engineers of a racially reordered Europe. In meetings with Heydrich, with bureaucrats and lawyers, he refined policies that read like administrative memos and functioned as death warrants. How to identify enemies, how to categorize populations, how to integrate murder into the chain of command so that it would appear as routine as rationing. Reinhard Heydrich, with his cold smile and surgical mind, became the man to give these ideas teeth. He took the chaos of conquest and translated it into template and timetable. The Reich Security Main Office, the RSHA, would be a central node, a nervous system connecting security, intelligence, and police. Heydrich's office drew org charts and flowcharts as if designing a factory. Names were not merely names. They were nodes in a network, tagged and cross-referenced for action. The Einsatzgruppen were conceived not as rogue murderers, but as specialized units to execute a policy drafted in offices like this: mobile, flexible, and brutally efficient. The phrase, war of annihilation, sounds rhetorical, but here it became operational. It implied a leveling of moral fences. Soldiers were told that the constraints of civilized warfare would not apply in the East. The Commissar Order and other directives instructed officers to treat political officers, partisans, and Jews as obstacles to be removed. An analogy helps. Imagine a gardener who decides that certain plants threaten the health of the garden. Rather than pruning carefully, he plans to burn the soil and start anew. That gardener was the Nazi leadership. The garden was Eastern Europe. Preparing for such a campaign required coordination across ministries, across uniforms, and across moral lines. The Wehrmacht, the SS, the Gestapo, local police forces, all had to be synchronized. Meetings in Berlin became choreography sessions for death. How many men to deploy, how to coordinate with advancing fronts, how to set up temporary incarceration sites, how to move prisoners. Logistics were paramount. Trains, fuel, ammunition, and rifles were counted and rationed. So were bullets for executions and trucks for transporting bodies. The language of procurement, orders, requisitions, manifests, masked the ultimate purpose. Paperwork made murder legible and therefore actionable. The planners understood that sheer numbers would be a problem. The Soviet Union was vast, with millions of people who would, according to Nazi doctrine, need to be neutralized in some fashion. Mass shooting seemed feasible early on, but there were concerns about psychological strain on killers and the inefficiency of firing squads for millions. Debates flared. Should killing be decentralized or centralized? Should it be public or hidden? Each option had trade-offs in logistics, secrecy, and propaganda. Yet even those debates betrayed administrative thinking, choices made as if solving an engineering problem, not confronting the humanity of victims. One of the most chilling outcomes of these discussions was the idea of mobile, specialized detachments that could follow the army and immediately clear newly conquered areas. These units would not be regular infantry. They would be composed of SS men, police battalions, and collaborators trained to do one thing: execute. The term Einsatzgruppe, task force, sounded neutral, even bureaucratic. It masked everything that was to come. Names, numbers, and units were assigned. Leaders were chosen for their ruthlessness or their ability to obey without moral hesitation. Training materials emphasized speed and order. Drills were held not just for combat, but for roundup procedures, for the safe transport of detainees, the efficient digging of graves, the cataloging of bodies. Propaganda played its role. The extermination plan required consent, at least passive consent, from the German population and complicity from occupied societies. Newspapers and radio hammered the narrative of a united threat, fused Bolshevism and Jewishness into one enemy, and depicted the East as a land of barbarism that needed civilizing. The language was metaphor and dehumanization. Words like vermin, pest, and plague eased the cognitive distance necessary for mass murder. When people are seen as disease, killing is framed as cleansing. Such rhetoric created a moral anesthetic across a society that would otherwise recoil. Diplomatic calculations mattered too. The Nazis knew international scrutiny would be high. They planned layers of secrecy, euphemisms, coded communication, and compartmentalized orders. The chain of command was deliberately complex so that responsibility could be diffused. Men who issued orders rarely stood on the execution grounds. Officers in distant offices signed directives. Men in the field carried them out. It was moral outsourcing, decisions made in comfort, violence enacted by others. That gap between thought and action enabled bureaucrats to sleep, to dine, to continue their lives while presiding over mass murder. Yet not everyone within the German structure accepted these plans without reservation. Some Wehrmacht officers worried about discipline and the corrosive effect on soldiers required to kill civilians en masse. Their objections were framed pragmatically. Atrocities could provoke resistance. They might tarnish the army's professionalism. They were not moral dissenters so much as strategists worried about backlash. Hitler and Himmler dismissed such concerns, arguing that ideological war required a new code. The leadership insisted that ruthlessness would secure long-term victory. They equated horror with strategy. To execute such a plan, local collaboration was also essential. The Nazis cultivated local auxiliaries among those who harbored grievances or saw opportunity. Police forces, nationalist groups, anti-communist factions. In some places, these collaborators were eager participants, driven by long-standing ethnic tensions or desire for power. In others, they were coerced or manipulated. But their participation was crucial. They provided local knowledge, manpower, and the political cover that made mass killings easier. The Einsatzgruppen would often operate with peacetime police officers and local militias at their side, blending foreign command with domestic complicity. The planners also considered the psychological toll on their own men. Orders were issued to desensitize killers, to make murder routine. Procedures were formalized: how to herd people, how to separate families, how to ensure witnesses could not report. Medical officers were asked to anesthetize methods of execution and language, special measures, evacuation. The Nazis tested techniques in small operations, noting the effects on perpetrators and adjusting instructions accordingly. Language and ritual became tools of control. Uniforms, badges, and ceremonies that transformed brutality into professional duty. Economics, too, was woven into the calculus. Property seized from murdered victims could fund the war effort. Goods looted from occupied territories were requisitioned. Clothing, jewelry, and even teeth were collected and inventoried. There was a grotesque accounting of plunder that turned human lives into assets to be processed. The administrative mind loved such efficiency. It turned genocide into bookkeeping. As plans hardened, a series of preparatory directives left little to chance. Lists of undesirables were compiled from pre-war censuses, intelligence files, and denunciations. Railway timetables were adjusted to carry troops and later to move prisoners. Temporary holding sites were scouted. Fields, forests, and redundant facilities that could be repurposed into execution zones. Local commanders received memos outlining their roles: cordon off a village, assemble the population, search for weapons, separate categories based on arbitrary markers. Then, the final act: execution. Every memo read like a supply order, a grotesque testament to how normalized destruction had become. In the quiet of the winter months before Barbarossa, Heydrich and Himmler convened plans that would later be recited in courtrooms as evidence of intent. They discussed deadlines, reporting procedures, and the lines of authority that would ensure compliance. They insisted on documentation, records of actions, numbers of bodies, and after-action reports. To them, documentation meant control and accountability within the regime. To the victims, it meant a ledger of crimes. The irony was bitter and deliberate. The system that prized record-keeping would leave behind the testimony that destroyed its excuses. Yet even at this stage, some ambiguity lingered among lower-level officers about the extent of what had been decided. Orders could be interpreted broadly or narrowly. Local commanders exercised discretion. In some cases, this meant brutality multiplied. In others, commanders slowed actions, delayed certain measures, or exploited loopholes. The machine was vast but not perfectly synchronized. Small acts of hesitation or improvisation could change outcomes. Delaying a roundup could save a life. But such mercy was fragile and risky. Under a regime that rewarded efficiency and punished doubt, hesitation was rare and costly. When final orders were given and the panzers rolled toward the east, the architecture of annihilation rolled with them. The Einsatzgruppen were not winged phantoms. They were companies of men with names and faces, with pasts and families, and with new orders that would define them. They carried with them the plans drawn in smoke-filled rooms, to secure supply lines, to eliminate partisan leadership, to purge Jewish communities and ideological opponents. They would move town to town, village to village, leaving behind ravines and graves and a paper trail. The contrast between the deliberation in Berlin and the smell of earth and gunpowder at the front could not be more stark. In conference rooms, maps were marked in red and blue. At execution sites, fields turned scarlet in an entirely different sense. The planners had sought to externalize the act of killing, to clear the intellectual distance between decision and deed. But the reality resisted neat compartments. When the rubber met the road, the sounds of death, screams, shots, the thud of bodies, complicated cold logistics with raw human agony. As the invasion loomed, there was a sense of terrible anticipation among those who had designed the system. They believed they were architects of destiny, refining the instruments of history. In their minds, the campaign promised a new order, territories settled by the fit, resources reallocated to the Reich, futures rewritten. They forgot, deliberately or not, that plans become actions only through human hands and hearts. That ideology becomes carnage when translated in emotion. In the dim study where the map lay, a man exhaled and the smoke curled upward, hiding the edges of the inked lines for a moment. The map did not tremble. The men around it did not flinch. They had decided how the world would end for millions. The war they planned would be measured not simply in borders won or lost, but in lives erased. The machinery of annihilation was designed, calibrated, and set to turn. Outside the windows, winter light hardened into silence. Somewhere beyond the city, trains began to move. Men packed their bags. Orders circulated. The ink on the directives had barely dried. By the time the sun rose over the eastern horizon, the lines drawn in ink would meet flesh. The planners had no illusions about the scale, only confidence in their method. The war of annihilation was no longer a phrase, but a program. The only remaining question was whether the world would comprehend, and whether anyone could stop what had already been set in motion. And as the first engines of the invasion warmed, one chilling truth remained unspoken in the rooms of power. When ideology becomes administration, cruelty becomes policy, and the steps from thought to massacre shorten until they are indistinguishable from a march. Chapter 5. The 4 death squads. It begins with a list, a neat column of names, a set of coordinates, a tally of villages to be secured. The paper is small, the ink precise. A hand moves down the list with the calm of a clerk ordering supplies. No blood stains the page. Yet each line will be answered with gunshots. This is how modern murder often begins, not with heat and chaos, but with a tidy plan. The plan in this case was to split a continent into sectors and assign each sector a team whose sole task would be to remove, in cold sequence, those deemed enemies of the Reich. They called them Einsatzgruppen, task groups. The men who would lead them wore tidy uniforms and carried briefcases. They carried ideals and checklists, and, beneath it all, a readiness to kill. The idea was deceptively simple. Instead of relying solely on camps or improvised pogroms, the Nazi leadership would create mobile units, small, flexible, and lethal, that could follow the armies as they advanced into the Soviet Union. Think of them like surgical teams that moved behind a battlefield to remove critical obstacles. Only the surgeons here had rifles, and their operations targeted entire populations. Each group would be responsible for a geographic ribbon of territory, working in concert with local police, the regular army, and often with local collaborators who held old grudges or newly found ambitions. The aim was not merely to pacify resistance. The aim, declared or implied, was annihilation. Commanders were chosen for specific traits. This was not a selection for charisma or popular bravery, but for administrative coldness, ideological loyalty, and an ability to translate orders into action without moral delay. A man who could keep records and shoot accurately was valued more highly than a man whose conscience would cause him to hesitate. Some of the names associated with the early formation of these units would later be carved into histories. Experienced police officials, SS officers who had risen through the bureaucracy, men who understood that violence could be managed like any other public service. In training rooms and conference halls, they practiced logistics, not morality. They practiced how to cordon a town, how to separate a crowd into categories, how to minimize witnesses, and how to remove the physical evidence afterward if required. Einsatzgruppe A, Einsatzgruppe B, Einsatzgruppe C, Einsatzgruppe D. 4 ribbons of violence mapped across the eastern frontier, each with its own route, each with its own horrors. The letters sound abstract at first, A, B, C, D, like chapters in a manual. But they were living instruments, and where they moved, towns emptied, houses were looted, synagogues burned, and fields were dug to receive the dead. These death squads were not clandestine mobs. They were organized units with radios, vehicles, and clerks who filled out forms after each action. Efficiency, in their language, was a virtue. Brutality, in their hands, became routine. When a detachment entered a town, the choreography was precise. Soldiers ringed the streets, boots scuffed cobbles and dirt. The air tasted of smoke and dust, sometimes of bread burning in ovens now abandoned. Orders were barked in clipped phrases. Men with clipboards and pencils moved through crowds, checking names off lists compiled in distant offices. At a signal, families were pushed together in squares or on riverbanks. The men administering the operation attended to trivial details with the same care as the larger atrocity. Who would hold the cordon, who would record the numbers, who would photograph the bodies. This administrative attention to detail was part of what made the killings so chilling. You could see it in the neat rows where people were made to stand, in the way execution pits were scooped, in the way uniforms were kept clean even as blood soaked the earth. Collaboration was central to their method. The Einsatzgruppen rarely operated alone. They worked with Ordnungspolizei units, with regular police battalions, and often with local auxiliaries. Men who knew the villages, who could point out the houses of wealthy Jews, the meeting halls of community leaders, the locations of families who had been prominent. In many towns, decades-old ethnic tensions were reactivated and amplified. Neighbors who once bartered at markets now became informants. The occupying units exploited these fissures, turning local knowledge into a tool of destruction. In some cases, collaboration was voluntary, driven by hatred or opportunism. In others, it was coerced by intimidation and survival. Either way, it multiplied their reach. The mechanics of murder took on a bureaucratic face. After an operation, reports were compiled. Names, ages, alleged reasons for execution, number of rounds fired, method of disposal. Sometimes photographs were attached, grim proof for superior officers who wanted verification. The reports were routed up chains of command, logged, and filed. The system prized documentation. It was as if every death needed an accounting entry to legitimize it, to translate atrocity into a ledger that could be understood by managers in far-off offices. The chilling result was a paper trail that recorded the scale of inhumanity with a neatness that would later serve as evidence against many of those who had signed. And then there were the methods. Shooting was the simplest and most common method in the early months. Victims rounded, lined up on the edge of a pit, shot, and buried. The sound was abrupt, mechanical. The smell afterward, powder, iron, damp soil, hung in the air. In many sites, the executions were staged at dawn when fields were quiet and witnesses minimal. But as operations continued, variations emerged. Mass shootings in ravines, rounded up victims forced to dig their own graves before being killed. Shootings at forest edges where the trees swallowed the sounds. Some commanders experimented with gas delivery in trucks or other means. The choices were pragmatic as much as ideological. What was fastest? What created the least disturbance? What could be implemented with available resources? The men who carried out these killings came from varied backgrounds. Some were hardened SS veterans. Some were policemen with peacetime dossiers of arrests. Some were men who had been promoted out of administrative competence rather than battlefield courage. There were lawyers who had once argued in courtrooms, factory foremen, teachers who had once taught arithmetic. The transformation from civilian to executioner was not instantaneous. It was built on a sequence of small steps: prior training, euphemistic language, the normalization of violence, the reward of promotions and praise. The psychological strategies employed were calculated: alcohol before operations, group reinforcement afterwards, ceremonies that framed brutality as duty. The men adapted or they broke. Those who adapted became terrifyingly ordinary. Resistance did not vanish. In towns where Jewish councils or partisan groups attempted to fight back, reprisals were immediate and severe. A single act of defiance could bring the whole community into the killing ground. The Einsatzgruppen rarely sought fair combat. They sought example. Public executions were used as spectacle, warning to populations that the cost of resistance was collective annihilation. These spectacles were intended to terrorize, not to avenge. They were staged like warnings and photographed like trophies. The psychological calculus was brutal and efficient. Terrorize to control, control to kill with minimal military cost. There were also practical problems. Shooting thousands of people was logistically demanding. Ammunition had to be allocated, graves dug, corpses managed in ways that could not be ignored by locals or by soldiers. Bodies in mass graves required burial methods that could later be hidden or, if the tide turned, exhumed and burned. These practicalities forced adaptations. Units began to coordinate with cremation teams, with engineers who could dig deeper pits, with local contractors who could provide trucks. It was industrial murder with supply chains and maintenance schedules. The violence had ripple effects. Soldiers who watched these executions, those from the regular army as well as police, were affected. Some became numb. Some developed symptoms of what we might now call moral injury. Nightmares, tremors, a hardening that revealed itself in later cruelty. Others protested and were sidelined. The leadership's response to faint-heartedness was simple: replace, promote, reward cruelty. Loyalty and effectiveness were measured not only in victories, but in the ability to carry out orders without question. In this way, the Einsatzgruppen became a testing ground for those the regime thought capable of mass killing on a grander scale. Even in the grim machinery, There were grotesque detailings of routine. Photographs taken after operations sometimes ended up framed in officers' quarters as if trophies. Watches, wedding rings, and metal spoons were inventoried. The living world of the victims, children's toys, prayer books, coats, were often piled and photographed. Looting was embedded into operations as a perk and as economic plunder. This theft further dehumanized victims, turning their private lives into disposable spoils to be processed and cataloged. Despite planning and coordination, variability marked their actions. In some regions, the killing was rapid and systematic. In others, local commanders hesitated, delayed, or improvised cruelty differently. Weather, local resistance, supply lines, the temperament of commanders, all influenced outcomes. A spring mud could stall operations. A quick partisan ambush could provoke mass reprisals. This variability did not obscure the pattern. Where the Einsatzgruppen went, death multiplied. The human stories that threaded through these operations were wrenching. Survivors later recounted the rituals of humiliation before execution. Forced to sing, to undress, to stand in the cold while soldiers debated the logistics of their death. Mothers shielded children for as long as they could. Fathers tried to bargain with faces of men who had once sat on the same benches at church. The intimacy of some killings, neighbors turning in neighbors, local informants pointing out families, made the atrocities not just remote crimes but community betrayals that would stain towns for generations. The small, ordinary details, filed teeth, charred prayer shawls, a child's sock found under a corpse, made history granular and unbearably present. And yet the commanders rarely faced immediate consequence. Many returned to Berlin for debriefings, to promotions, to awards. They described operations in clinical terms. They spoke of numbers. They rarely spoke of faces. In exceptions, some officers confessed to private turmoil. A few even sought reassignment. Those cases were rarer than the rule. The bureaucratic architecture of the Nazi state protected its foot soldiers. They were following orders. They were preserving the nation. This legalistic masquerade allowed administrative functionaries to sleep at night while mountains of evidence accumulated. As summer moved into autumn, the scale expanded. The initial operations that had seemed like localized nightmares became, in the planner's view, successful prototypes. The Einsatzgruppen had demonstrated a grim utility. They could be deployed quickly, they could harness local auxiliaries, and they could be reported on, measured, and emulated. Commanders in Berlin took note. The approach could be scaled. Orders altered, resources increased. More personnel were trained in the particular arts of rounding up, herding, and executing. The terror metastasized from towns to regions, from regions to entire provinces. Yet even in triumph, practical limits and moral reckonings emerged. The psychological toll on killers, the spread of disease among mass graves, the logistical strain of digging and covering pits, all became operational headaches. The regime's answer was to adapt. Specialized units to destroy evidence, organized exhumation and burning programs when retreat loomed, methods to make future concealment more likely. The state that had industrialized murder now specialized in concealing it. And the world beyond the killing fields remained largely unaware of the mechanisms at work. News traveled slowly, and propaganda muffled many reports. Local populations often learned the truth only in the aftermath, when neighbors did not return and when grief turned to memory. For those left alive, memory was a burden heavier than any physical wound. For the perpetrators, memory was something to be erased through silence or transformed in a bureaucratic routine. By the time winter crept over the plains, the map of death had been drawn and redrawn many times. The Einsatzgruppen's paths etched lines across the countryside, ribbons of emptied villages, cemeteries full of anonymous graves, and towns where the clocks had stopped. Commanders compared notes, shared best practices, and wrote memos that refined methods like manuals for cruelty. In office lights, they debated efficiency and method. In field shadows, they carried out the decisions. And yet, there remained a question that even the planners could not answer neatly. What would happen when the war turned? When the front lines rewound and the evidence cannot be hidden? How would a nation built on meticulous record-keeping reconcile the traces of what it had done? The men who filled those files and drew those maps could not imagine all consequences, but they were beginning to notice a different fear, not of foreign bullets, but of the ledger that would one day be opened. The Einsatzgruppen had been born from order and calculation. They had been designed by men who loved lists and loathed hesitation. They had functioned with bureaucratic precision and horrific efficiency. And yet, even at their height, the seeds of their undoing were being sown in the very paperwork that legitimized their deeds. For now, their work continued, town after town, field after field, until the day when some of those lists would be used to charge the living. In a village square, where once the market bells had rung, the ground lay still, a scattering of ash, a child's shoe half buried in mud. The sun set cold and indifferent. Somewhere down the road, a command car idled while officers compared notes. They laughed about logistics. They argued over methods. Behind them, under the soil, the dead waited. The squads moved on, their task unfinished, their efficiency unchecked. The next town lay ahead, and with it a fresh tally to be begun. Chapter 6. Into the Soviet Union. The morning the invasion began, the sky over the frontier was a brittle, empty blue. Engines hummed like a swarm of insects. Soldiers tasted metal and diesel on their tongues. At dawn on June 22, 1941, the Wehrmacht moved east, and with it came a different kind of force. Units that did not seek to hold ground so much as to remake it by erasing those who lived there. The Einsatzgruppen followed like a shadow, folding themselves into columns of trucks and staff cars, their orders pinned in neat folders. They smelled of leather, oil, and ink. They smelled like business. What they were about to do smelled of something else entirely. Crossing that border changed everything. For the German command, the Soviet Union was not merely another opponent. It was the theater for a war of racial annihilation. In practice, that meant the troops at the front were accompanied by men whose mission was not tactical victory, but social and biological reordering. Their tasks were outlined in crisp language. Identify political leaders, neutralize partisans, eliminate Jews, and remove any elements that could contest German rule. The words on the paper read like security directives. The deeds in the field amounted to murder. Those first weeks were a test of mobility and nerve. Einsatz units split into detachments that poured into cities and shtetls, into villages and railway hubs. They arrived by road and rail, sometimes by horse, often by warning. In many places, the first visible sign of terror was not gunfire but lists. Lists compiled from pre-war census data, from local informants, from decades of bureaucratic files now used as kill orders. Men carrying pens became executioners. Clerks became accomplices. The procedural normality of ticking boxes before massacre was one of the era's most dreadful innovations. The early targets were predictable in the eyes of Nazi planners. Party officials, policemen, teachers, priests, those who shaped public life and could lead resistance. They were also indiscriminate in certain places. Entire Jewish communities were singled out for destruction irrespective of any political role. Commands from higher up emphasized speed. The idea was to prevent disorder by eliminating the seed of resistance before it could sprout. In the field, speed meant rounding up families at dawn, marching them to forest edges or ravines, and firing in cold rows while clerks recorded the numbers for the ledger back in Berlin. The first scenes were various and terrible. In some towns, men in uniform went house to house and dragged people into the streets amid confusion and screams. In other places, community leaders were arrested in the middle of a council meeting, as if they were accused of a paperwork violation. There was a distinct choreography to many operations: cordon, search, separation, selection, execution. It was efficient and theatrical at once, a perverse ritual that turned civilians into statistics within hours. Local collaborators multiplied the cruelty. In many regions, occupiers recruited auxiliaries from nationalist groups, police units, or those with personal grudges. These auxiliaries knew the terrain, the families, who had debts, who had long quarrels, knowledge that was weaponized in the purge. Where collaborators were eager, the pace of murder accelerated. Where they were reluctant or scarce, German units improvised with grim determination. The result was the same. Ordinary communities split along fault lines. Neighbors turned into informants. Old quarrels inflamed into lethal accusations. The Wehrmacht's reaction varied. Some field commanders protested the excesses, worried that massacres would provoke partisan warfare that would complicate supply lines and strategy. Their objections were often tactical rather than moral. This will make the population hostile, they warned. But most complaints dissolved when political officers invoked higher orders and ideological urgency. In many cases, the army provided logistical support, cordons, transport, even manpower, and turned a blind eye to the moral abyss because it suited operations on the ground. Cooperation, indifference, and occasional friction shaped the reality of occupation. Details matter here because they show how brutal ordinary life became. Imagine a train station on a humid morning. Stalls that had sold bread and tobacco the day before are shuttered. A mother clutches a child and is told to join a line. A man in a civilian suit is led away despite his protests. A blue-coated clerk checks a name against a list. A truck idles with its engine ticking. You hear the scrape of boots, the soft rustle of papers, a baby whimpering. Then the sudden, mechanized sound of a lorry door shutting. Those sounds repeat across the countryside, and each repetition trains a kind of numbness into the listeners. The methods of killing were brutal and, at times, improvisational. Shooting was the primary method early on, quick, direct, terrifyingly personal. Victims were often forced to dig their own graves before being shot at close range. The act left physical traces that were impossible to conceal. Blood, hair, the smell of powder, the soggy churn of earth. In some instances, execution sites were chosen for their convenience. A hollow under trees, a roadside ditch, a riverbank. In others, they were chosen for the spectacle. Public squares where terror could be maximized and used as a lesson for those left alive. The psychological mechanics of ordering these killings were deliberate. Commanders instructed men to refer to victims by their category, Jews, Bolsheviks, hostile elements, rather than as humans. Language anesthetized conscience. Steps in the procedure were given mundane labels: assembly, processing, evacuation. That bureaucratic lexicon allowed soldiers to translate murder into tasks, and so to sleep afterwards. Men who would never have been brutal in civilian life found a strange ease in procedural violence. Fill out the form, carry out the task, sign the report. Not all men could adapt. Some soldiers broke, convinced they could not continue. They were quietly transferred, punished, or sometimes reassigned to other duties. Others hardened immediately, their humanity corroded by repetition and approval. The regime rewarded those who showed resoluteness and initiative. Promotions, medals, and conspicuous praise reinforced a culture where cruelty became a route to status. A troubling internal logic took hold. The more effective you were at destruction, the more you were trusted with responsibility. Reports returned to Berlin with a chilling regularity. Field officers filed dispatches that read like daily logs. Names eliminated, villages cleared, numbers of bodies buried. The language was clinical, yet the content was monstrous. Higher officers in security services recorded these metrics like production figures. The data became both the proof of success and a mechanism for further planning. With each report, the program was refined, transport routes were adjusted, methods of disposal debated, local auxiliaries recruited, logistics tightened. The machinery grew. Often, the executions were accompanied by looting and degradation. Soldiers and local auxiliaries stripped homes of valuables, piling clothing and artifacts in heaps. Torah scrolls, prayer shawls, family photos, letters, the intimate residue of lives, were tossed with the carelessness of people clearing out a wardrobe. This theft was both opportunistic and bureaucratic. Valuables were cataloged, gold teeth extracted and inventoried. The act of taking seemed to dehumanize the victims further, turning their remains into goods to be processed and distributed. Resistance emerged in several forms. Some partisan bands formed almost immediately, striking back in harsh and often desperate ways. In response, reprisals were swift and indiscriminate. A burned village here, 100 hostages shot there. Jewish councils in some places attempted to organize welfare and escape routes. In other locations, underground networks tried to smuggle people out to safer zones. These acts of courage were often crushed, but not always before they saved lives. Small acts, hiding under floorboards, bribing guards, disguising identity, sometimes worked. Survival was a combination of luck, courage, and the right mixture of obscurity. The people who carried out the massacres were not always monsters by background. They were policemen, reserve officers, civil servants, men who had families and childhoods. The transformation into killers was enabled by a mixture of obedience, ideology, and social pressure. Ritual played a role: a morning roll call, a sermon by an officer reminding men of duty, a shared cigarette after an operation, a toast to the Führer. The human need for belonging could be twisted into a readiness to commit atrocities on behalf of the group. Sometimes the killings took on a grotesque theatricality. Photographs taken by some units show officers posing after operations, faces grave, uniforms immaculate, piles of seized objects in neat stacks. These images speak to psychological dissonance. How men could be proud of deeds that elsewhere would be called monstrous. The photos were tokens of proof for superiors, trophies for memory, and later, invaluable evidence for courts and historians. Even so, logistical problems haunted the operations. Ammunition had to be rationed, pits dug in rain and frost, bodies buried in shallow graves that sometimes surfaced with thaw. Disease threatened both survivors and perpetrators. The stench of decomposition could travel for miles on hot winds, a suffocating reminder of what had been done. In some locales, units experimented with other methods for disposing of bodies to avoid such problems. These experiments foreshadowed the industrialization of killing that would follow. Religious life was torn apart. Synagogues, where they existed, were desecrated or burned. Rabbis were humiliated, leaders murdered. Congregations vanished from streets where they had once worshipped. The familiar rhythms of ritual and holiday were replaced by a calendar of terror, days of roundup, of forced marches, of mass graves. For those who survived the first weeks, every bell and every shutter could signal a new sweep. And yet, amidst this machinery, rare acts of humanity flickered. There are accounts of soldiers who, at risk to themselves, smuggled food to a neighbor, of a partisan who spared a child, of a clerk who quietly destroyed a list to save a name. These acts were exceptions, not norms, but they remind us that even in the darkest hours some souls resisted the current of complicity. They also complicate simple narratives of victim and perpetrator, showing how moral choices persisted in a world that sought to erase them. As summer moved into the heat of that first year, the path of the Einsatzgruppen carried them deeper into Soviet territory. Towns that had been bustling markets in May were emptied squares in August. Rivers that had reflected innocent skies now tracked the shadows of bodies taken to their banks. The sound of artillery and the sound of gunfire mixed in the air, but it was often the latter, the precise, close-range work of the death squads, that left the most enduring marks on local memory. By autumn, reports from the field grew darker and more methodical. Intelligence officers demanded lists of remaining suspect elements. Commands urged more aggressive timetables. The boundaries of who could be killed expanded and contracted with bureaucratic decisions. A quota here, a reprisal there, a new regulation that broadened the category of enemy. The program was not a single, monolithic command, but a dynamic system constantly tuned by orders, convenience, and local initiative. And always, under the roar of engines and the rustle of paperwork, the human cost mounted. A mother counting the days since she had last seen her son. A child clutching an animal that no longer provided comfort. A grave unmarked, soil settling over a life. The Einsatzgruppen's movement across the map left these human traces as its true record. As winter loomed and the front lines hardened into a stalemate in some sectors, a particular kind of dread settled. Units that had been efficient in summer faced the cold and the problem of the exposed evidence of their crimes. Bodies that could not be hidden by snow, graves that were visible to approaching patrols, witnesses still living. The planners in Berlin began to fret about concealment, even as they ordered more killings. The same men who had organized the assault were now arguing about how to erase the traces. Their calculations took them down new paths of horror. In a ravine outside a city whose name would later be whispered with horror, villagers walking at dawn would stumble on a slope of newly turned earth and the glint of metallic objects. They would not know then the scope of the acts already committed nearby. But in the weeks to come the ravine would fill. The trucks would return. The clerks would add to their lists. The men in neat uniforms would continue to move east, colder now and more practiced, carrying with them the methodologies of death and the conviction that they were merely carrying out orders. Chapter 7. The First Massacres. They came in trains and trucks and open lorries, but the killing began in the quiet hours, before dawn, when towns smelled of smoke and stale bread and the world was still pretending nothing had changed. Men in uniform moved through streets like a cold tide, their boots muffled on cobbles wet with last night's rain. Doors were kicked. Lamps were snuffed. Eyes, still heavy with sleep, looked out from windows and saw uniforms, clipboards, lists. The first massacres in the Baltic and Ukrainian lands did not explode into history like thunder. They unfolded with the slow, precise rhythm of a machine starting up, gears meshing, cogs locking, the mechanism of mass murder finding its tempo. In Kaunas, the city known as Kovna to some and Cowan to others, the air tasted of wood smoke and the metallic tang of nervous hands. The Lithuanian town was a patchwork. Markets, synagogues, wooden houses. On certain streets, laughter still drifted from kitchens. By morning, the laughter had been replaced by the whisper of rope and the chatter of lists. Groups were ordered into the square. Men with clipboards read names. A mother clutched a shawl. A child's hair smelled of soap and yesterday's bread. Then came the command to move. People were marched to the outskirts where pits waited like silent mouths. The shooters were steady. The earth drank. This was not chaos. It was process. In Vilnius, Vilnius, a city with libraries and long traditions of Jewish learning, the massacres took on a tragic, intimate quality. Men who had once argued about scripture in small study houses found themselves pushed into trucks and driven to the pine forest beyond the city. There, in a place called Ponary, the trees kept their indifferent watch. The soil was loamy and damp underfoot. The smell of pine sap mingled with the sour odor of fear. The methods varied. Sometimes victims were made to undress, sometimes forced to dig shallow pits with their bare hands before the shots. The noise was not always a fusillade. Often, it was the single, final snap that punctured the air. Survivors would speak later of the sound of the soil falling back into place. Final, sealed, mute. The Baltic and Ukrainian massacres were not uniform. Each had its local inflection, shaped by history and the personal animosities of neighbors. In some towns, the violence was immediate and the locals simply fled. In others, it was steady in public, dressed up as legal dispatches. In Riga, in Latvia, lists were compiled with a meticulousness that made the killings feel like an administrative task. Names, addresses, occupations, recorded. The neat handwriting on forms became the last human artifact for many. A clerk's flourish on a page could mean the difference between life and death. That is how banal evil often asserts itself, not with speeches and fanfare, but with the tiny gestures of paperwork. Local collaboration shaped the pattern and speed of the massacres. Where auxiliaries formed quickly, Baltic militias, anti-Soviet nationalists, or opportunistic police volunteers, the killing accelerated. These collaborators were complex figures, some driven by ideology, some by the hope of looting, some by long-standing vendettas. They knew who had crossed whom at market stalls, who had owned what land before wars and seizures. They could point with a finger and change a life. In Ponary and beyond, local shooters stood alongside men in German uniforms, sometimes with a grim concentration that matched their foreign partners. In other places, locals resisted recruitment or tried to hide neighbors. Such defiance could be punished by fire and blood. One of the most searing features of these early massacres was the way ritual mingled with terror. At times the occupiers staged the roundups with a grotesque efficiency. Bells tolled in churches to call people for work one moment, then were used to herd the same people into squares the next. Priests and rabbis stood bewildered as ceremonies of daily life were interrupted by orders to present identity papers. Food carts left half-filled as mothers were dragged toward trucks. Everyday rhythms were inverted into instruments of control. The familiar became the trap. Photographs from these early days, taken secretly by survivors, later by investigators, show faces contorted with terror and, sometimes, incredulity. A man with flour on his hands, caught mid-step. A woman's shawl askew as she is pulled along. A child turns toward the camera and a moment later described again and again in witness testimony. These images are small punctures through time, proof that ordinary life existed right up until the instant it did not. The images also demonstrate the grotesque normalcy that had taken over the perpetrators. Their uniforms were clean, their hair combed, their gestures matter-of-fact. The Einsatzgruppen's presence made the difference between looting and systematic murder. These units, assembled from police, SS, and security services, carried with them a doctrine. Where political and racial categories overlapped, death was a tool. They moved with lists drawn from censuses, synagogue records, and local denunciations. In many towns, an inventory of citizens had already been compiled during the interwar years by local authorities. In others, neighbors made ad hoc lists, naming those with Jewish ancestry or those who had worked with the previous regime. The machinery of record-keeping, ledgers, birth registers, tax rolls, became instruments of execution. The past, cataloged and precise, was turned into a manual for murder. Language played a betrayal. Officials used words like resettlement and security operation. They spoke of evacuations and liquidations. To the victims, these euphemisms were a slow, criminal logic that erased the rawness of the act. To the perpetrators, the language was anesthesia. It muffled conscience and made the next step, shooting, burying, moving on, more bearable. And so the orders were given and obeyed. The men in the field made their routines: cordon, search, separate, march, shoot, document. Then they returned to vehicles, inked another report, and drove to the next town. The mechanics of killing left physical and psychological traces. Mass graves were dug, some hurried and shallow, others deeper and almost ceremonial. The stench of decomposing bodies hovered later over certain fields, a sickly cloud in humid months. Survivors who later came to retrieve what remained spoke of clothes fished out of mud, prayer shawls charred at the edges, toys muddied and torn. In some places, the earth refused to accept what had been done. The ground shifted, graves collapsed in spring thaw, bones surfaced like obscene warnings. Those scenes would force later efforts at concealment and exhumation, but in these early months the perpetrators were focused more on speed than secrecy. Not all killers were equally eager. The ranks included civil servants who had once argued about contracts, policemen who had enforced small-town bylaws, and men who looked like neighbors. For some, the transition was fast. For others, it was a series of small steps that dislodged their moral anchors. First a task that felt administrative, then a duty that asked for minor cruelty, and finally orders to shoot. There were moments of moral rupture. Men who refused and were sent away, men who drank themselves into silence, men who wrote home in strange, taught language about special actions. The transformations were not universal, but the social machinery often rewarded those who complied and punished those who did not. Witnesses left testimonies that revealed the texture of those days. An old man described the sound of a child's shoe being trodden into mud. A baker recalled the quiet between the rounds when the birds tried to sing over the echoes of gunfire. A woman recalled how a neighbor she had known for 40 years now stood with a rifle and refused to meet her eyes. These tiny details, shoes, birds, the avoidance of eye contact, are the human grain in the documentary record. They show how everyday sensory life was twisted into a theater of horror. The psychological effects on perpetrators were notable. Some men developed nightmares, uncontrollable tremors, the hollowing that later historians would describe bluntly as moral injury. Others adapted too well, shrugging and finding solace in camaraderie and the approval of superiors. The regime institutionalized reward systems, medals, commendations, promotions. Men who performed in the field were praised in reports, their names noted for future assignments. In that way, a culture of lethal competency took hold. Excellence in extermination was transmuted into career currency. International reaction was slow and confused. Reports slipped out, rumors, partially documented accounts, whispered letters smuggled across borders, but the world had been numbed by the blitz of military campaigns and diplomatic lies. For many, the idea that organized, bureaucratic mass murder could take place with such ordinary tools, clipboards, lists, trucks, was simply beyond comprehension. The ability of the Nazis to reinvent policing as death-dealing work confounded early efforts at intervention. Resistance arose in pockets. In some cities, underground networks tried to hide people in attics, cellars, and convents. In others, partisan groups formed trenches and small-scale ambushes. These acts, brave as they were, often resulted in reprisals that targeted entire villages. The occupiers understood the deterrent power of collective punishment and wielded it ruthlessly. Yet resistance persisted. A clandestine passageway, a false identity card, a backroom plan to smuggle a child out of town. Those actions saved lives, and their stories survive as quiet, fierce testimonies to human resilience. There was looting as well, systematic, petty, economic. Clothes, jewelry, household objects, even books, were taken and inventoried. The economic aspect of the massacres was not incidental. Confiscated property funded occupation costs and enriched local collaborators. The theft compounded the violence. It turned personal histories into goods to be marked and sold. A wedding ring became an archival entry. A family fortune became supplies for the occupying troops. This conversion of life into assets was another way the regime codified and normalized atrocity. As autumn pressed toward winter, the scale of killings in the Baltic and Ukrainian territories grew. The initial massacres had become templates, procedures that could be replicated by the dozen. Methods were refined. The command structures reinforced successes and disciplined failures. Units that showed initiative were quietly rewarded with more autonomy. That autonomy, combined with the logistical infrastructure of occupation, railways, depots, and administrative buildings, meant the killing could spread faster and further. And still the world watched, often unable or unwilling to grasp the reality unfolding. Local populations bore the burden of memory. Families that survived carried the ghost scent of smoke and powder for decades. Children who hid in barns grew into adults who told their children in whispers what had happened under the pines. Those memories were not just personal. They shaped communities, changing the ways towns remembered their own pasts. Streets that had bustled with markets were haunted by absence. Synagogues stood as empty shells or were converted to other uses. Time, which heals some wounds, became in these places an instrument of forgetting, one that survivors resisted with the stubbornness of the grieving. By the end of that season, A grim geography had been drawn across the map. Regional patterns of empty towns, ravines, burned houses. The perpetrators had learned to move fast and record even faster. The use of local auxiliaries had turned neighbor against neighbor in ways that would outlast the war. The killing had not yet reached the scale of extermination camps, but had the raw, intimate terror of person-to-person murder. The look in a shooter's eye, the feel of soil shoveled into a grave, the small, private acts of cruelty that leave no public record. As these first massacres settled into a brutal rhythm, questions began to arise among the planners in Berlin. How scalable was this model? How to maintain secrecy while expanding scope? How to manage the psychological toll on killers? Those questions would lead to experimentation, to horrific innovation, and to the next, deadlier chapter of this campaign. In the forests and ravines where the first graves had been dug, the birds settled again, as if to sing the world back into ordinariness. But their songs could not drown the memory of what had been done. The ink on the lists kept drying. The trucks kept rolling. And somewhere, beyond the forests, a large ravine waited, a place where tens of thousands would soon be taken, and where history would later demand to know how such things had been permitted to begin. Chapter 8. Babi Yar, the Ravine of Death. The morning air over Kiev tasted of ash and diesel. In the city, life tried to keep its ordinary rhythms. Bakers set out loaves. Trams hissed along rails. Children chased each other between carts. Then orders arrived like a new season, sudden, inexorable, and chillingly specific. On September 29th and 30th, 1941, a ravine on the outskirts of the city would become a ledger of death. In that hollow, the earth would take 33,000 souls in 2 days. The number is almost too large to comprehend, yet the way it unfolded was maddeningly procedural. Lists, cordons, trucks, the sharp bark of commands, the hush before the volley, the thud of bodies, the sound of soil pushed back into place. This was not an eruption of rage. It was an exercise in terrible efficiency. Babi Yar had been an ordinary place once. A stream cutting a shallow valley, a suburb where people walked dogs and children played. By the time the Germans entered Kiev, the ravine slope was known to locals as a quiet boundary between neighborhoods. It was also, tragically, convenient. Its banks provided a ready-made pit. The neo-language of occupation, security measures, curfews, evacuations, had already filled the air. People were rounded up not because of any public proclamations, but because of lists compiled in offices, because of rumors and identification papers and the cold ink of bureaucracy. The transformation of an everyday place into a graveyard began in the same small, banal steps that had opened the way everywhere. Notices nailed to doors, orders read aloud, train timetables adjusted, townspeople summoned to points of assembly. The day the town was emptied, the orders were precise. Men with clipboards checked names against lists. Women were ordered to bring only what they could carry. Parents clutched children. The smell of boiled cabbage from the market mingled with smoke, and the tremble of expectation ran through the crowd like an electric current. People were told they were being relocated for their safety, for labor in the East. Lies dressed up as logistics. The commandants wanted compliance. Deception was a tool. Many who had learned to trust authority in small things, in appointments and municipal notices, believed them again. They boarded trucks and cars, not knowing the destination would be a ravine and the cargo would never return. When the convoy reached Babi Yar, the choreography of killing began. Men in uniform formed a cordon. Local police and auxiliaries assisted. Clerks and photographers recorded the scene. The victims were ordered to disrobe, to leave personal papers and tiny keepsakes in a pile, to step forward in neat lines. The sound in that place must have been surreal. The rustle of clothing, the creak of leather, a baby's cry, the distant hiss of a tram. Then the volley. The sadness of the everyday, the way a mother's apron smelled after making bread, was swallowed by the roar of gunfire. Bodies and clothing collapsed into the hollow, soil falling back like a curtain. What made Babi Yar particularly horrifying was its scale and its intimacy. This was not an anonymous killing in a field where the victims were strangers to one another. They were neighbors, colleagues, tailors, school teachers, the cantor from the main synagogue, the man who fixed shoes on the corner. They arrived in clusters, clutching the fragile threads of their ordinary lives. The execution in the ravine turned a community into a mathematical event. Names counted, faces cataloged, humans reduced to data points and reports that would be filed and archived. That reduction was deliberate. It created distance between perpetrator and victim, a bureaucratic veil that allowed men in neat uniforms to walk away after the deed and prepare the next report. Many perpetrators were precise, almost meticulous in their methods. Execution squads arranged the victims in trenches at the edge of the ravine, ordered them to kneel, and fired. Other squads covered the scene, preventing escape. The shots were close, personal, intimate in the most dreadful sense. For the shooters, the action sometimes felt like a grim ritual. Aim, pull, note, move on. Later, in reports, officers would write of the scene as if describing an exercise. Numbers, times, and operational details. The dry formality of those documents is what made them so useful later for historians and prosecutors. They betrayed an administrative mind behind the murder. Auxiliaries played a role that cannot be overstated. Local police, nationalist formations, and men looking for opportunity or vengeance often assisted with rounding up citizens and with guarding the perimeter. The occupied territories were riddled with old grievances. Neighbor against neighbor, landlord against tenant, community rivalries buried in decades of history. The occupiers exploited these fissures, turning local disputes into mechanisms of violence. In Kiev, the presence of collaborators made the operation faster, more intimate, more devastating. Where the killers could point to a face and say, "He is on the list," betrayal landed like a glove, snug and sure. The logistics were both banal and monstrous. Trucks were requisitioned, blankets piled and later stamped as contraband. Watches and rings were taken, inventoried, and sometimes packed into crates. The personal effects were both spoils and evidence, the trace of a life that had been. Clerks handled lists, photographers took records, drivers idled their engines. The entire scene had the flavor of a grim office. Memos, signatures, inventories. It was as if the act of killing had been folded into the everyday rhythms of administration. Report, send, archive. Witnesses later provided fragments that, when stitched together, formed a portrait of the weeks that followed. Survivors spoke of the silence between gunshots, the odd hush that comes after a volley, when the birds, for a heartbeat, forgot how to sing. They described the small things: a shawl snagged on a branch, a child's shoe found in the mud, a pocketbook with a picture of a husband gone. Those details anchor the enormity of the massacre in human terms. They remind us that behind policy and directive were lives organized around ordinary pleasures and pains. A neighbor's joke, the smell of fresh bread, the sound of music on a winter evening. Photographs taken afterward, evidence for later investigators, showed the scale: piles of clothing, empty shoes in heaps, discarded prayer shawls. The images were both proof and indictment. They were also a cruel testimony to the perpetrator's sense of order. Clothing was often stacked, items inventoried. The attention to detail, matching shoes, separating jewelry, reflected a mind that saw human beings as removable and their possessions as registrable assets. Even in the act of taking, the killers continued the habit of cataloging that had guided their work. There were also small acts of resistance and extraordinary courage. Some people, realizing the lie too late, tried to hide under wagons or among the bushes near the ravine. A few survived by pretending to be dead, by feigning injury, by slipping into confusion after the shooters moved on. Others tried to distract guards, to bribe a driver, to smudge a name on a list. These acts were rare and perilous, but they mattered. In the tiny margins of survival, whole future lives were preserved, children who would grow up to remember and to tell. The psychological landscape of the perpetrators was complex and chilling. Some later claimed they were simply following orders, that they were conditioned by duty and the language of statecraft. Others showed a grim pleasure in the power to decide life and death. A few broke under the strain, vomiting, drinking heavily, returning home to nightmares that would not let them sleep. But for many, the administrative disguise insulated them. They wrote reports, received commendations, and were reassigned to other tasks, as if nothing personal had been required of them. That return to normalcy, dining with family, reading a newspaper, taking a walk, after overseeing a mass killing, is one of the most disconcerting aspects of how the machinery of murder operated. In the aftermath, efforts to bury and conceal the bodies began, but they were inconsistent at first. Mass graves were initially the method of choice, deep pits where the bodies could be covered and left. Later, as retreats loomed and the threat of discovery increased, the occupying forces organized deliberate programs to exhume and burn remains to hide evidence. Yet at Babi Yar, the initial burial was hurried. In the cold of progress and the eagerness of the killers to move on, the graves were sometimes shallow. Spring thaw would later reveal bones and clothing at the surface, a cruel exposure that forced further attempts at erasure and then, eventually, a reckoning that the killers themselves had intended to hide. The international world reacted in fragments. Rumors filtered out, and some foreign news outlets tried to report on mass killings. But the full scope and certainty of events like Babi Yar did not immediately penetrate the public imagination. The scale was so vast, and the mechanisms so bureaucratic that it challenged comprehension. It sounded like fantasy. And yet, when survivors and investigators later brought testimonies and physical evidence to light, the story took shape in courts and archives. The paper trail, so cherished by the perpetrators for its administrative clarity, would become a tool for justice. In the years after, Babi Yar became a name loaded with meaning. For survivors and descendants, the ravine was a wound. For the historians, it was a case study in how mass murder can be organized. For the perpetrators, it was both success and a source of later fear. Men who had participated knew the ground would remember that list would not stay secret, that someone, someday, might open an office file and read the names aloud. The same compulsion to record what had been done would, ironically, become part of the evidence that ensured later accountability. Babi Yar's echo was not only forensic, it was moral. The massacre revealed the stark truth that extermination was not confined to gas chambers or distant camps. It could be, and was, carried out in daylight, in public spaces, and sometimes in the sight of neighbors. The everyday tools of administration, clipboards, trains, trucks, lists, could be harnessed to horrific ends. The massacre thus blurred any neat line between the machinery of government and the instruments of death. It showed how the ordinary routines of governance could be perverted into systems of annihilation. Even as the leaves turned and the cold approached, the ravine smoldered in memory. People who had survived carried the images like embers, the smell of gunpowder and turned earth embedded in their dreams. Those who had been forced to assist, the clerks who tallied the lists, the drivers who carried bodies, the auxiliaries who had pointed out names, lived with different burdens, shame, denial, or hardened pride. The city itself tried, in its way, to move on. Markets reopened. Trams ran. Yet the physical presence of the ravine, and the evidence that accumulated there, was a persistent residue that refused to be absorbed by routine. And in offices far from the hollow, the same patterns of reporting and calculation continued. Dispatches reached Berlin. Names, numbers, and operational notes were filed. The apparatus that had planned the war of annihilation watched the results with the cold satisfaction of administrators checking metrics. The success of Babi Yar informed later directives: how to coordinate with local auxiliaries, how to use geography to facilitate mass killings, how to organize trains and trucks with lethal efficiency. The ravine had taught lessons that the killers would apply again and again. Yet a quiet question haunted those who had ordered it. Could such things remain hidden forever? The same habits of documentation, that had enabled these killings might one day expose them. Papers kept for administrative clarity would in the future be opened under the harsh light of courts and historians. Names written in neat ink would be read aloud in rooms where the dead had no voice. For now, the paper sat in files. For now, the city tried to breathe. But the ledger would not be closed. As dusk sank into Kyiv and the ravine lay in the shadow of trees, the ground held the story in a silence so heavy it felt like a presence. Somewhere, in the quiet of barracks, men compared notes. Somewhere, a clerk carefully crossed a name off a list and filed it away. The act felt ordinary to them. To the world, it would later appear monstrous. The hulking question remained: if a city could be emptied in a weekend, what would the next week bring? Chapter 9. The Bureaucracy of Murder. The first time a clerk recorded a name and then watched a line of people march toward a pit, he did not see himself as a killer. He saw a form, a column to be filled, a box to tick. The pen hesitated for a moment, ink pooling like a tiny dark lake, then moved on. The world beyond the window kept its ordinary noises: a cart creaking, a dog barking, a child shout. Inside the office, the clerk's hand made neat loops on a sheet that would later be filed in a ledger. That ledger would be used to justify a death that would be counted like an inventory. The transformation from human life to line item is the central horror of the Einsatzgruppen story. Murder made administrable, guilt ritualized into routine, atrocity translated into paperwork. Bureaucracy is a mundane thing. It loves boxes and stamps, dates and initials. It is a machine for making the complex legible. The Nazi state, with its appetite for order, seized on that love and turned it into something lethal. Where other governments used forms to register births, taxes, or property, the Nazi apparatus used similar forms to map targets, to authorize killings, to record bodies buried and valuables seized. The same typists, the same clerks, the same filing systems that had once kept civic life functioning now kept track of annihilation. The language of administration, euphemism, protocol, signature blocks, became a moral anesthetic. What was written down acquired a patina of legitimacy. At the top of this architecture were men who understood the power of documentation. Reinhard Heydrich's Reich Security Main Office prized record-keeping not merely for logistics, but for control. Reports flowed like blood through the veins of the machine. Operational reports from field units, lists of enemies neutralized, requisition forms for transportation and fuel, requests for ammunition, inventories of seized property. The tone of many of these documents is clinical, even perfunctory. Dates, places, head counts. They read like minutes of a factory meeting, save for the fact that the factory produced death. The unsettling normalcy of these reports is a measure of how deeply the bureaucracy had colonized morality. The paperwork began before the bullets. The Nazis compiled lists, censuses repurposed, synagogue records seized, tax rolls exploited, pre-war record-keeping, municipal registries, and even school rosters offered the raw material for the kill lists. In many towns, local officials, sometimes willingly, sometimes coerced, produced names and addresses. A birth certificate, a registration card, a note in a ledger. These small administrative artifacts could become the thread that led to a grave. To be legible to the state was to be vulnerable. The state read its citizens and, when it chose, pronounced them dispensable. Orders moved down the chain like trains on a timetable. A district chief in Berlin wrote a directive. An SS officer signed his initials. A field commander received the folder and acted. The chain of command both diffused responsibility and tightened control. Men in faraway offices could issue orders and insulate themselves from the sensory reality of the act. No smell of gunpowder, no sight of the child's shoe. That psychological distance was intentional. It allowed planners to speak of quotas and security measures with the same detachment as one might speak of harvests. To the clerks who processed the forms, the papers were evidence of obedience and efficiency. Euphemism was the glue that held the system together. Every atrocity was dressed in administrative language. Special treatment replaced words like murder. Resettlement swapped for deportation. Evacuation meant elimination. These substitutions were not accidental. They were tools. They allowed perpetrators to describe monstrous acts without confronting the moral weight of their choices. In reports, it was easier to state that 300 were evacuated on this date than to acknowledge what had happened to those people. Euphemism created a buffer of language between action and conscience. The bureaucratic process also demanded proof. Field commanders were encouraged to file reports that verified their actions. How many were killed? Where they had been buried? How many bullets were used? Photographic evidence, too, was often required. Grim postcards of execution sites, piles of clothing, towers of shoes. Officers who could furnish neat, verifiable records were rewarded. Those who produced sloppy paperwork were approached. That hunger for documentation meant that murder was not only committed but archived. The archive, intended to prove loyalty and success, would later become a map for prosecution. Paperwork was not abstract. It required physical space and labor. Offices filled with clerks, typists, and archivists hummed long after the guns fell silent. The clatter of typewriters, the scratch of fountain pens, the stamp of official seals. These sounds were part of the theater of murder. Men with ink-stained fingers cross-checked lists, collated reports, and sent dispatches. Each file that left an office was one more legal covering for a crime. The bureaucracy needed people, numbers of them, to function, and those people were complicit whether they fired a rifle or typed a name. The process of robbery and appropriation was equally administrative. Seized property was inventoried, labeled, and transported. Gold teeth, watches, jewelry, household goods, cataloged down to the last spoon. The plunder financed parts of the war effort and enriched pockets along the way. Receipt books recorded goods taken from the dead. Warehouse ledgers stored lists of items. The reduction of a life world to a consignment list was another act of erasure. It stripped identity from objects that had once been treasured. For the clerks, counting spoils was as mundane as any logistical task. For victims, it was the final indignity. Legalism and pseudo-legal justifications were another layer. The Nazis placed a protective veneer of legality over violent acts, issuing decrees and internal memos that created categories of undesirables and authorized security operations. Lawyers in the Reich drafted contracts and opinions that retrofitted murder into administrative frameworks. Law, a language normally meant to restrain violence, was repurposed to instruct and legitimize it. Signatures and stamps lent weight to brutality. A stamped order could be waived in defense months later as compliance with higher directives. That legalistic posture confused later debates about culpability and made the bureaucratic role in genocide harder to disentangle. Even the act of concealment was bureaucratic. As the tide of war shifted, the same administrative minds devised programs for exhumation, burning, and the removal of corpses. Operations like Action 1005 were planned with memos, schedules, and checklists. Engineers, SS detachments, and sometimes prisoners were tasked with the grim work of destroying evidence. Lists were made of burial sites to be excavated, of fuels to be used, of ovens and pyres needed. The attempt to erase traces required organization on an industrial scale. Even the cover-up was systematic. Individual responsibility became slippery in such a system. A clerk could say he merely transmitted a file. A transport officer could say he only drove the trucks. A commander could claim he only followed orders. The architecture of roles meant culpability could be diffused, but the diffusion was not ethical exoneration. The cumulative effect of choices, paper signed, train scheduled, order passed, created the machinery of death. Each small professional act, taken alone, looked trivial. Taken together, they built a highway to genocide. The human cost within the bureaucracy was not only on the victims. Perpetrators bore psychological marks too, though they were different. Some clerks later described nights haunted by the names they had written. Others boasted, with a terrible pride, of their efficiency. A few destroyed records mentally by drinking, by laughter in bars, by returning to family dinners as if nothing had happened. The cognitive dissonance required to live two lives, one of domestic normalcy and one of administrative criminality, split many men apart. The paperwork, which had been meant to keep conscience at bay, sometimes became a burden that could not be shed in sleep. Resistance to the bureaucratic apparatus existed, but was dangerous and rare. Some civil servants, local officials, municipal clerks attempted to hide or alter records, to delay lists, to misfile names. Others risked their lives to warn families or to prepare false documents. The very act of altering a ledger could spare a life. These acts of bureaucratic sabotage were small rebellions against the machine, demonstrating that paperwork could also save. Yet they were exceptions in a landscape of compliance, and when discovered, they were punished harshly. The courts after the war would wrestle with this architecture of administration. Prosecutors combed through offices, reading dispatches that had once been badges of loyalty and now revealed the scale of crimes. Often, the documents that had been used to prove efficiency became the evidence that secured convictions. The ledger had come full circle, from instrument of annihilation to instrument of accountability. The archives that had once comforted perpetrators with their order now condemned them with their clarity. But even as papers piled up and trials convened, many records remained lost, destroyed, or hidden. Some files have been burned, others shipped to unknown storage. The deliberate fragmentation of documentation was itself an administrative tactic. Men who had participated in atrocities tried to erase their trails, yet the sheer volume of reporting, the redundancy built into the system, made total concealment impossible. Small mistakes, duplicate copies, and the human habit of keeping souvenirs under a mattress meant evidence survived despite efforts to annihilate it. The bureaucracy also reveals the social mechanics of evil. How societies convert cruelty into functions that people can inhabit without seeing themselves as monstrous. It shows how roles, clerk, transport officer, registrar, archivist, can become moral zones where responsibility is narrowed to the next action. It shows how institutions can diffuse conscience and create a culture where paperwork replaces judgment. The lesson is not merely historical. It is a warning about the human propensity to hide behind roles when asked to make moral choices. Even within this machinery, individual stories break through. A secretary who quietly slipped a warning into a file, a transport worker who looked the other way while a child escaped from under a tarp, a magistrate who delayed a deportation by days. These acts remind us that within bureaucracies there is room for resistance, for compassion, for choice. They remind us the human element remains, even in the most mechanized systems. As the war waned and the evidence of destruction became harder to hide, the ledger's pages assumed a new weight. Files once stamped completed became tinder for testimonies. Those who had punch clocks in offices were called before tribunals. Some recanted, some confessed, some denied. The paper trail ensured that evasion would be harder than imagined. The bureaucracy that had administered murder had also preserved the memory of it. And so the ledger keeps opening. Names written in neat script reappear in courtrooms, in museum exhibits, in family trees. Each line is a story, each stamp a sentence. The bureaucratic heart of the Holocaust, cold, procedural, meticulous, remains one of its most disturbing features. Because it shows how ordinary systems of administration can be turned into instruments of catastrophe when ideology and obedience replace judgment and humanity. Outside the office window, the day continues. A cart creaks, a dog barks, a child laughs. Inside, files lie waiting, their pages crisp and white, inked with names. A clerk reaches for the next folder and pauses. His hand trembles slightly. He thinks of the ledger he has built, of the boxes filled and the voices silenced. He knows the signatures on the next pages will not be forgotten. He knows someone, somewhere, will later read them aloud. The papers will not stay buried. The system that printed them will not survive the light. And when the files are opened, the ledger will speak. Chapter 10. The Human Machinery. It was not the smell of blood that haunted them first. It was the sound. The sound of boots on wet soil, the echo of shots swallowed by forest, the hush that followed when all noise fell away. For those who fired, for those who watched, and for those who signed orders far behind the front, the silence after killing was louder than any command barked or any crowd assembled. It is there, in that silence, that the human machinery of the Einsatzgruppen truly begins to reveal itself. Not only the metal and fuel, not only the trucks and rifles, but the minds and bodies that made them function. The story of these men is not one of monsters in uniform, but of human beings, educated, cultured, ambitious, who willingly turned their intelligence into instruments of death. Heinrich Himmler called them soldiers of ideology, an elite breed forged from loyalty and obedience. In truth, they were bureaucrats of killing, products of a system that rewarded detachment and demanded devotion. Some came from the police, others from academia, law, or business. They had been trained not merely to shoot, but to justify. A historian could become an intelligence officer. A lawyer could become a field executioner. The transition was seamless because the ideology that shaped them did not see murder as crime, but as cleansing. They were told they were not destroying life. They were preserving civilization from its supposed enemies. At the core of this human machinery stood a handful of architects, men like Reinhard Heydrich, Otto Ollendorf, Paul Blobel, and Arthur Northeast by East. They were not identical in temperament or background, but each represented a piece of the psychological blueprint that made the Einsatzgruppen work. Heydrich, elegant and cold, saw himself as an engineer of racial destiny. His genius lay in organization, in taking the chaos of hate and giving it structure. Ollendorf, an economist by training, approached murder with the logic of an auditor, calculating efficiency, studying morale, writing reports that treated death like a ledger. Blobel, a construction engineer, would later be tasked with erasing the evidence, designing methods for burning corpses to ash. Northeast by East, once a police detective, drifted between hesitation and zeal, his conscience corroded by ambition. These men were not fanatics frothing with hatred. They were technicians of ideology, their emotions buried beneath procedure. The soldiers under them came from every corner of German life. Some were veterans of earlier wars. Others were young recruits eager for purpose. They drank together, sang together, and shot together. In their letters home, they wrote about the weather, about meals, about pay. They rarely mentioned the killings directly. When they did, it was cloaked in language learned from their superiors. Phrases like special action, cleansing, security measure. The euphemisms allowed them to write without confessing, to feel without naming. It was a shared vocabulary of denial, and it ran like oil through the machinery. Obedience was their creed, but obedience alone does not explain what they did. It was belief, twisted, nurtured, rationalized, that made obedience lethal. They believed they were saving Germany, that the Jews and the Bolsheviks were one and the same. That mercy was betrayal. They had been taught this for years, in classrooms, in newspapers, in rallies. By the time they were handed rifles, they did not need persuasion. The enemy had already been stripped of humanity in their minds. When they aimed, they did not see individuals. They saw contagion. Yet not all of them were hardened killers from the first shot. Many hesitated. The first execution often tore through the nerves. Men vomited, trembled, drank heavily afterward. Some turned pale and begged for reassignment. Himmler himself, witnessing a mass shooting near Minsk, was said to have nearly fainted. But the machine required endurance, and endurance was taught. Officers ordered their men to watch, to participate, to overcome weakness. The process of killing became ritualized repetition. Shoot, reload, shoot again, until the act no longer registered as moral choice, but as task completed. The repetition dulled the senses, replacing empathy with rhythm. Alcohol became a lubricant of courage and numbness. After executions, vodka or schnapps flowed freely. The men toasted each other, sang songs, laughed too loudly. It was a parody of camaraderie, a way to drown the dissonance. In the haze of intoxication, conscience blurred. By the next morning, the orders would come again, and the machinery would move. Some men began to take pride in their steadiness. They called themselves hardened. What they meant was hollowed. Psychologists who later studied them found a pattern. Few were driven by sadism alone. Most were conformists, men desperate to belong, afraid to stand apart. They feared ridicule more than guilt. They did not want to be seen as weak. And within the closed world of the Einsatzgruppen, weakness was treason. Each man's silence reinforced the next. Together, they built a wall of shared complicity that no one dared to breach. In this way, mass murder became not the act of isolated monsters, but of groups bound by peer pressure and pride. The commanders nurtured this atmosphere. They spoke of duty, of history watching, of destiny. They quoted Hitler's speeches, spoke of blood and soil, invoked the myth of racial struggle. Some even prayed before the killings, convinced they were carrying out divine justice. The perversion of faith added another layer of justification, turning conscience into a servant of ideology. When questioned after the war, many said the same thing. They believed they were defending civilization. To them, the dead were not victims. They were necessary sacrifices. In the ranks, personal motives varied. Some killed because they hated, some because they feared, others because they wanted promotion or medals. The system did not care which motive drove them, only that they performed. A man's worth was measured in numbers, how many elements he had processed, how efficiently his unit functioned. Reports went upward, signed, sealed, praised. Praise meant survival. Hesitation meant replacement. The machinery rewarded speed and punished reflection. It was not ideology alone that kept it running. It was careerism, competition, and the small ambitions of ordinary men. The bureaucracy shaped their daily lives. Orders came through in the morning, targets assigned, trucks fueled. By evening, reports were drafted. The rhythm became a grotesque routine, blending the mundane with the monstrous. There were moments when reality bled through. A child's scream, the smell of blood on a uniform, a face in the crowd that looked familiar. Some men wept. Others looked away. The system allowed for that. It did not need every man to be cruel. It only needed them not to refuse. In letters later found among ruins, soldiers wrote strange sentences that seem almost schizophrenic. "We had an operation today. It went well. I think often of you in the garden. I can't say what we're doing here. The weather is fine. The birches are beautiful this time of year." Between those lines lies the human mechanism of denial, the ability to compartmentalize horror in normal life. This compartmentalization was not a flaw. It was the feature that made them efficient. A man who could kill and then admire the sky was more useful than one who hesitated at the sight of a corpse. Above them, the chain of command insulated itself with abstraction. Reports came in. Statistics were compiled. Summaries typed. The higher officers read numbers, not names. They discussed quotas, not corpses. They argued over logistics, too many bullets used, not enough trucks, delays in fuel delivery. To them, the killings were administrative challenges. That distance between decision and execution was crucial. It made atrocity sustainable. Those at the top could remain civilized, well-mannered, even cultured, while orchestrating chaos. One of the darkest paradoxes of this system was its professionalism. The Einsatzgruppen prided themselves on discipline, order, precision. They held briefings, wrote manuals, conducted inspections. Commanders corrected subordinates for inefficiency, not for cruelty. The language of competence replaced the language of conscience. It was not evil that drove the machine, it was proficiency. And in that proficiency lay the true horror, the realization that bureaucracy and morality can diverge so completely that a man can feel pride in perfect murder. Even within this machinery, there were cracks. A few men tried to resist, quietly, subtly. They sabotaged vehicles, delayed orders, warned civilians. Others sought transfer, pretending illness or inventing administrative excuses. But the system had ways of absorbing dissent. For every man who faltered, another stepped forward. The machine did not need all its parts to be loyal. It only needed enough to keep turning. Over time, the killings changed the killers. Photographs taken months apart show the difference. Faces that began smooth and youthful became tight, gray, hollow-eyed. The 1,000-yard stare that soldiers later described came not only from battle, but from routine slaughter. Some grew reckless, craving danger as distraction. Others grew silent, their humanity eroding in degrees. The same hands that once trembled began to move automatically. By the winter of 1942, the process of dehumanization was complete. They had become their function. Civilians saw this transformation and felt both terror and disbelief. How could men who smiled politely at a market, who tipped their caps to old women, spend the afternoon at a ravine shooting families? The answer was both simple and devastating. They no longer saw those families as human. Propaganda, hierarchy, and repetition had stripped empathy from their perception. Once empathy dies, cruelty becomes ordinary. The system's success depended on that death of empathy. The shooters were rotated to avoid fatigue, but the moral fatigue was permanent. To cope, they told themselves lies. The victims were enemies. The war required sacrifice. Someone else would do it if they refused. Each lie was a thread in the fabric of self-preservation. Together, they formed a net strong enough to catch guilt before it could take shape. When the war began to turn, when rumors spread that the front was collapsing and the Soviets were advancing, some of the men began to fear retribution. They spoke quietly about burning documents, erasing evidence, transferring elsewhere. Others laughed it off. But even laughter had changed by then. It was sharp, forced, the sound of men who no longer believed their own invincibility. The machinery was beginning to tremble, yet it continued to function, grinding onward, consuming lives until the very end. After the war, many of these men were captured, interrogated, tried. In courtrooms, they sat in neat rows, hair combed, uniforms gone. They spoke calmly, methodically, explaining procedures as if giving lectures on management. They did not deny the killings. They denied intent. They insisted they had obeyed orders, that refusal would have meant death, that they were cogs in a larger wheel. They used the same language of detachment that had shielded them during the crimes. To listen to them was to understand how thoroughly they had become their jobs. Historians later pored over their testimonies, looking for remorse, for cracks of humanity. Some found it, a trembling voice, a confession of nightmares, a memory that refused to die. But most spoke with an eerie calm. They had long ago divorced emotion from action. The courtroom demanded moral reckoning. They offered procedure. The world wanted confession. They offered efficiency. And yet, beneath all their words, one truth remained. The Einsatzgruppen were not an alien species. They were men, fathers, sons, neighbors, who had allowed ideology and obedience to replace empathy. The machinery of murder was built from human choices, each small enough to seem insignificant until added together. That is why their story remains terrifying, because it shows how evil can wear the face of ordinary men doing ordinary work. In the end, the machinery fell silent. The trucks were abandoned, the rifles rusted, the papers burned. The men scattered, some captured, some escaped, some returned to lives that pretended to forget. But the echo of their actions did not fade. It lingers in the archives and testimonies, in the soil of the ravines they filled. It lingers in the understanding that civilization's greatest danger lies not in rage, but in obedience without question. Somewhere in a forgotten field, a fragment of a uniform button still gleams under the dirt. It once belonged to a man who believed he was just doing his duty. He followed orders, filled reports, made sure the trucks ran on time. He thought of himself as part of something greater. He never saw that the machinery he served was not Germany, not destiny, but death itself. The machine was human, and it worked because humans made it work. And in that recognition lies the final horror, that the engine of genocide was never metal and oil, but flesh and thought, and it could be rebuilt anywhere men stop asking why. Chapter 11. Witnesses to the Abyss. The night after the shootings, the sky over the ravine was strangely quiet. The air smelled of gunpowder, clay, and the faint sweetness of rotting leaves. The trees stood motionless, their trunks streaked with soot and fragments of cloth. The earth itself seemed swollen with secrets. Beneath that soil lay tens of thousands of bodies, and among them, a handful of people who still breathed. These were the witnesses, the accidental survivors of the Einsatzgruppen's fury. They were the ones who would crawl out from under heaps of corpses, who would carry the sound of that silence for the rest of their lives. History, when it finally tried to speak of the Holocaust by bullets, would depend on them. In the beginning, no one wanted to believe what they saw. Even the witnesses themselves struggled to make sense of it. Some had survived because the bullets missed, others because they had fallen before the firing began. They lay buried under the dead for hours, barely daring to breathe, tasting soil and blood. When night came and the voices of the killers faded, they clawed their way upward through layers of bodies, gasping as they broke the surface. The first thing many remembered was the sound of the night, the croak of frogs, the rustle of grass, the faint hiss of wind. The world had resumed its rhythm, indifferent to what had been done to it. Those who escaped stumbled toward villages or forests. They were half blind, half mad, covered in blood that was not their own. Some were found by farmers who offered bread in silence. Others were handed back to the authorities, out of fear or malice or a desperate wish for safety. Every survivor's story began the same way: disbelief, disorientation, an almost animal urge to hide. But those who lived carried more than scars. They carried the memory of a world inverted, where uniforms meant death, where neighbors turned executioners, and where survival felt like guilt. The Einsatzgruppen had not intended for witnesses to exist. Their orders were to leave no trace, no testimony. But war is imperfect, and even the most efficient killers could not silence everyone. A handful of people escaped from pits in Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine. A woman named Dina Myronovna escaped from Rumbula near Riga, her body torn, but her will unbroken. A man named Mordecai Paperblack crawled out of the ground near Kovna, choking on dirt, his arms trembling so violently he could not stand. They would spend years hiding in barns, in forests, in swamps. Some joined partisans, their grief transmuted into vengeance. Others simply survived, living quietly, waiting for someone to listen. But in those early months, no one wanted to listen. The Soviet propaganda machine, while quick to denounce the invaders, often subsumed the Jewish suffering into a larger narrative of collective tragedy. To name the victims as Jews was, for a time, politically inconvenient. So the witnesses' words were muffled. Reports were gathered, then locked away. The testimonies that did emerge were so horrific that even sympathetic listeners doubted them. How could such things be organized with such coldness? How could the killing be so methodical, so mundane? The witnesses were telling the truth, but they were speaking a truth the world was not yet ready to hear. Some survivors became storytellers in exile. In displaced persons camps after the war, they sat with journalists, Red Cross officials, or historians who scribbled their words on cheap paper. The survivors spoke haltingly, their voices breaking, their sentences looping back in circles as if trying to reconstruct logic from chaos. They would say, "They made us undress." They would say, "We were told to stand in lines." They would say, "They shot the children first." Each word was a fragment of a mosaic too vast to assemble. But without those fragments, there would be no mosaic at all. The Einsatzgruppen had also produced witnesses of another kind, the perpetrators who documented their own crimes. Soldiers took photographs, not out of remorse but out of pride or curiosity. In one image, men smile in uniform while smoke rises behind them. In another, a line of victims kneel before a ravine while soldiers look on, arms folded. These images, intended as souvenirs or proof of success, became accidental witnesses. When the war ended and the photographs surfaced, they spoke more eloquently than any propaganda. A frozen moment of horror, grainy, framed, undeniable. They revealed how ordinary the killers looked, how human. Among the German ranks themselves, there were witnesses who did not participate but could not forget. Drivers, medics, clerks, men who stood on the edge of killing fields and watched. Some wrote home about it in careful, coded phrases. Others tried to blot it out. A few, years later, spoke in courtrooms, their voices trembling as they recounted the scenes they had once rationalized as duty. These reluctant witnesses bridged the abyss between victim and perpetrator. They proved that knowledge was not confined to a few madmen. It was diffused across the entire structure of occupation. Even among the local populations, memories lingered. Peasants who had seen smoke rising from forests, who had heard gunfire echoing from ravines, whispered of what they had seen. In the years after liberation, when investigators returned to those sites, villagers led them to the places where the ground had shifted unnaturally. They pointed to mounds of earth, to shoes that had surfaced after rain, to jewelry found in the mud. They remembered the trucks, the uniforms, the cries. Their recollections were not always precise, but they were consistent. The landscape itself became a witness, storing the memory of atrocity in soil and stone. The Einsatzgruppen did not only create victims, they created listeners. Every child who hid under a bed and heard the shots, every farmer who stumbled upon a ditch filled with bodies, every collaborator who turned away in shame. They were all witnesses. And memory is a dangerous thing. It cannot be fully erased, even by fire and fear. The Germans tried. In 1943, when the Red Army began to advance, Himmler ordered the graves exhumed. Special squads, often composed of Jewish prisoners, were forced to dig up decomposing corpses and burn them. The air filled with ash that rained down on forests and rivers. But even then, some of those forced laborers escaped, carrying with them the story of their grisly work. They became witnesses to the cover-up, chroniclers of erasure itself. In one testimony from a survivor of the exhumation units, a man described how the stench clung to their clothes, how the air felt heavy with grease from burning flesh. He said they worked by torchlight, digging, stacking, burning, covering, day after day. The Germans watched from a distance, smoking. The man survived by slipping into a ditch one night and crawling for miles through mud and thorns. His account, when read aloud in court decades later, made even hardened judges fall silent. It was not just the description of death. It was the detail of repetition. Killing, digging, burning, hiding, each act recorded, repeated, perfected. The survivors who lived to see the wars and became living archives. They returned to ruins, to villages emptied of family and friends. Many found nothing, no graves marked, no memorials raised. The new occupants of their towns avoided their eyes. Some were even hostile, accusing the survivors of inventing horrors. The witnesses became ghosts in their own homelands, unwanted reminders of complicity. Some fled west. Others stayed and wrote their memories into diaries and pamphlets. One woman in Vilnius wrote by candlelight, her sentences trembling, "If I do not write, it will be as if we never lived." The post-war trials gave them their first true audience. At Nuremberg and later in Einsatzgruppen trials, survivors stood in the same rooms as their former executioners. The courtroom smelled of ink and wood polish, not blood, but the air was heavy just the same. When witnesses took the stand, the world finally heard their voices. They described the forests, the screams, the orders shouted in German. The defendant sat behind glass, listening, sometimes smirking, sometimes looking away. The witnesses did not speak for revenge. They spoke from memory. They wanted the world to know what the bureaucrats of murder had done in daylight. The testimonies revealed patterns. The same procedures repeated from Poland to Ukraine, the same methods, the same phrases. They told us to dig. They told us to march. They told us to look at the ground. The repetition was not coincidence. It was policy. The Einsatzgruppen operated on a rhythm of destruction that could be transplanted anywhere. The witnesses exposed that rhythm to the light. Their stories turned statistics back into human beings, gave names to numbers, faces to ashes. Some witnesses, years later, found words insufficient. They turned to art, to music, to poetry. In Ukraine, a poet named Yevgeny Yevtushenko stood at Babi Yar decades after the massacre and wrote lines that trembled with grief and defiance. He wrote of silence, of memory, of the refusal to forget. His poem, set to music by Shostakovich, carried the voices of the dead across borders. It reminded the world that the ravine was not just a site of horror. It was a wound in human conscience that would never close. But the work of remembering was not easy. The Cold War buried archives. Politics shaped narratives. The Einsatzgruppen's crimes often remained in the shadows of the larger story of the Holocaust, overshadowed by the industrialized extermination camps that followed. Yet for those who had witnessed the shootings firsthand, the distinction mattered little. They had seen the face of evil before it wore the mask of industry. They had seen it up close, human to human, eye to eye. When researchers and historians later combed through the reports, they found the survivors' testimonies matched the killer's own records. The dates, the towns, the numbers, all aligned. The horror had been documented twice, once by those who committed it, and once by those who endured it. That convergence of memory and record made denial impossible, even if denial would still persist. The truth had been written in blood and in ink, and neither could be erased. As decades passed, the witnesses aged. Their voices grew thin. Their hands trembled when they spoke. Some could no longer sleep through the night. They would wake to phantom sounds, the crack of rifles, the sob of a child, the orders shouted in a language they never wished to hear again. But they continued to tell their stories. In schools, in museums, in interviews recorded for archives, they repeated what had happened. Their repetition was an act of resistance. Every retelling was a refusal to let the abyss swallow memory. There is a moment in nearly every survivor's testimony when the voice falters, not from fear, but from the unbearable burden of being the one left to remember. They pause, their breath catching. They say, "I can still see their faces." In that pause lives the weight of history. The Einsatzgruppen thought they could erase their crimes through efficiency and secrecy, but they underestimated the endurance of memory. They did not understand that the mind, like the earth, keeps what it is forced to bury. And so, the witnesses became the final countermeasure to the machinery of death. Where the killers left forms and statistics, the survivors left stories. Where the perpetrators sought silence, the witnesses created words. Their voices turned the ravines and fields into sacred places, not through monuments, but through remembrance. Every time they spoke, they reopened the earth, letting the light fall once more on what had been hidden. Today, when one stands at those places, Babi Yar, Ponary, Rumbula, Kamianets-Podilskyi, the wind still moves through the trees, the soil still shifts after rain. Beneath that soil lie fragments of bone, of memory, of warning. The voices of the witnesses are faint now, preserved on tape, in books, in fading ink. But they're still there, whispering across time. We saw, we remember, we speak. And as the world grows older, as generations forget the sound of gunfire in the trees, their words remain the only bridge across the abyss. The proof that even when humanity descends to its darkest depths, there will always be someone left to look back, to tell the story, to make the silence speak. Chapter 12. The Expansion of Death. The frost came early in 1942. The wind that swept across the Ukrainian plains carried with it the smell of burned wood, gunpowder, and something heavier, the scent of decay that lingered long after the shots had stopped. The war had entered a new phase, and so had the killings. What began as a campaign of mass shootings behind the front lines was now turning into something even more systematic. The Einsatzgruppen were no longer just units of extermination. They had become a model for an entire system of murder that would soon stretch across Europe. The ravines and fields of the East had taught the Nazis how to kill millions. Now, they were ready to perfect it. In Berlin, men in tailored uniforms studied the reports with cold fascination. The numbers were staggering. Hundreds of thousands executed within months. Columns of figures filled the pages like production data. Himmler and Heydrich read them as proof of efficiency. But behind the statistics was something else, a realization that the method, however effective, was also flawed. The shootings were slow, messy, psychologically draining. Even hardened officers were breaking down. Letters from the field described men vomiting, drinking to numb the horror, or begging for reassignment. Himmler understood that no machine could run if its cogs began to shatter. So, in quiet meetings behind closed doors, he began to search for a cleaner solution. The idea was not new. Since 1939, the Nazis had already experimented with mass murder through gas and the so-called euthanasia programs, killing the disabled in Germany under the pretext of mercy. Doctors and engineers had developed mobile gas vans, disguised as delivery trucks, where exhaust fumes were redirected into sealed compartments. These vans would now be repurposed for the East. Instead of bullets, carbon monoxide. Instead of pits, sealed metal chambers. It was efficiency by design, death that required less emotional labor. When the first gas vans arrived in occupied territories, they were greeted by curiosity more than dread. The men who operated them were not soldiers, but technicians. They checked valves, measured timings, ensured the doors sealed properly. They spoke the language of mechanics, not morality. In Minsk, in Chelmno, in smaller towns lost to memory, the vans parked quietly by the roadside. Victims were told they were being relocated. They stepped inside, confused by the darkness, the smell of gasoline, the echo of footsteps. The doors closed. The engine started. Within minutes, the world ended with a hum. Yet, even as this new method took shape, the Einsatzgruppen did not vanish. They adapted. The squads became the bridge between old and new, between the personal violence of the shootings and the industrial anonymity of the gas chambers. They continued to clear villages, round up Jews and partisans, and transport them to killing sites. But now, they also coordinated with construction units, with railway offices, with the bureaucrats planning larger extermination centers. The men who had learned to shoot thousands were now teaching others how to kill millions. By early 1942, the killing had become coordinated on a continental scale. Meetings in villas and government offices turned the language of genocide into policy. The Wannsee Conference, held in January, was the culmination of these discussions. Around a polished table, men in uniforms and suits spoke calmly about the final solution to the Jewish question. The minutes of that meeting survive, chilling in their precision. There were no raised voices, no crude hatred, just statistics and logistics. 11 million Jews in Europe, divided by region, scheduled for deportation and extermination. It was genocide described as administration, and its foundation had been laid by the Einsatzgruppen's success in the East. The squads, meanwhile, continued their work with mechanical consistency. In the forests of Belarus, villages were emptied. In the Baltics, survivors were hunted like fugitives. The sound of gunfire was as familiar as the wind. By now, killing had become a routine as ingrained as eating or marching. Orders came down each morning. Clear this town, search that settlement, report totals by nightfall. Reports sent back to Berlin described pacified areas and Judenfrei zones. The language had evolved into a kind of code, words that masked the horror behind a veil of professionalism. But within this mechanical rhythm, fragments of humanity flickered, brief, painful, fleeting. A soldier who stopped to help an old woman only to be reprimanded. A young man who looked away when child cried. A commander who wrote home describing hard duties in vague, trembling sentences. These cracks in the facade were small, but they revealed a truth. The system could function only if its participants stopped thinking of themselves as individuals. Once conscience entered, the gears jammed. The Germans were not alone in this machinery. Local collaborators continued to play crucial roles. In Poland, in Ukraine, in Lithuania, militias and police forces assisted with roundups and executions. Some acted out of ideology, some out of greed, others out of fear. Old grudges and jealousies were given deadly power. When German officers ordered lists of Jews, neighbors filled in the names. When soldiers came to collect valuables, locals helped find hiding places. Collaboration was not an exception, it was the rule. And in that collaboration, the line between occupier and occupied blurred into a shared complicity that would haunt nations for decades. As the front shifted eastward, the violence grew more indiscriminate. Partisan resistance intensified, and in response, the Germans unleashed reprisal campaigns that blurred any distinction between combatant and civilian. Entire villages were burned. Women and children were shot as suspected partisans. The Einsatzgruppen found new justification for their work. They were now not only purging racial enemies, but also suppressing rebellion. Each operation fed the illusion of necessity. Each massacre became a security measure. In the forests and marshes, the victims fought back. Jewish partisans, escaped prisoners, and Soviet soldiers formed ragged bands that harassed German supply lines. They carried homemade weapons, ambushed convoys, and sabotaged railways. Their resistance, though small in scale, was an act of defiance against annihilation itself. The Einsatzgruppen hunted them relentlessly. When they found partisan hideouts, they killed everyone: fighters, farmers, children. The logic was total. If one resisted, all must die. By the end of 1942, the map of occupied Eastern Europe was dotted with killing fields. The ravines of Ukraine, the forests of Belarus, the dunes of Latvia, all bore silent witness. Some had names that would echo forever: Babi Yar, Ponary, Rumbula. Others vanished into anonymity, their soil concealing the evidence. Yet the process had outgrown even these places. The camps, Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, now absorbed the mission once carried out by the squads. Gas chambers replaced firing squads. Crematoria replaced open pits. The men who had once stood over mass graves were reassigned to oversee trains, schedules, and deportations. The work continued, only now with less noise. For those still in the field, the transformation was disorienting. Some commanders resented losing authority to the camp administrators. Others welcomed the shift. It meant less physical killing, more paperwork. But the continuity was undeniable. The camps were the offspring of the ravines. The lessons learned in the East, how to deceive victims, how to process belongings, how to record numbers efficiently, were applied with terrifying precision. The Einsatzgruppen had shown that murder could be methodical. The camps proved that it could be industrial. Still, the shootings never truly stopped. In smaller towns, in remote forests, where rail lines did not reach, the bullets continued. There was always one more village to cleanse, one more convoy to intercept. In those final years, the killings became almost reflexive, as if the machine could not remember how to stop. By then, the perpetrators were no longer men performing duties. They were extensions of a policy that had consumed their identities. Some spoke of strange numbness, a hollow quiet where thought used to be. They did not feel victory or guilt, only exhaustion. When the war began to turn, when the Red Army advanced and the German retreat began, the Einsatzgruppen faced a new task: destruction of evidence. Orders were sent to exhume bodies, to burn remains, to obliterate graves. The same men who had filled the pits now dug them open again, choking on the stench of what they had done. Operation 1005, as it was known, was not a mission of defense. It was a confession written in smoke. The men who had murdered for the Reich now murdered its memory. They worked with the same precision, the same cold detachment. For them, it was just another assignment. Yet the earth does not forget. Even when the flames subsided, fragments remained: bone shards, teeth, buttons, wedding rings. When the Soviets retook those lands, they found the evidence beneath their boots. The reports, the photographs, the testimonies of survivors, all began to converge. The truth was too vast to conceal. The Einsatzgruppen shadow stretched across thousands of kilometers, across millions of lives. They had begun as 4 mobile units. By the war's end, their legacy was measured not in units, but in graves. The transformation of killing from rifle to gas chamber, from squad to system, was not a break in history. It was a continuation. The Einsatzgruppen had laid the moral and logistical foundation. They had proved to the Nazi leadership that mass murder could be organized, rationalized, and reported as success. The men who built the camps did not have to invent evil. They merely refined it. And when the war finally collapsed, when the Reich fell into rubble and silence, some of those men walked free. They blended into the post-war world, changing names, finding work, raising families. Others were caught, tried, hanged. But none could truly escape what they had built. The shadow of their deeds clung to them, invisible but absolute. They had turned obedience into a virtue, paperwork into a weapon, and life into a statistic. And in doing so, they had revealed something terrible about human nature: that civilization can murder methodically, and that the line between order and atrocity is thinner than we wish to believe. Somewhere, deep in a forest that once echoed with gunfire, the wind stirs the leaves. It whispers over forgotten graves, over soil that still shifts with each rain. The machinery of death has long since rusted away, but the silence it left behind remains, a silence that asks, endlessly, how men learned to kill with such order, and how a world allowed itself to learn from their example. Chapter 13. Operation 1005, Erasing the Dead. It began with a stench, a heavy, suffocating odor that clung to the air and the soil long after the gunfire stopped. The smell of death had become a permanent season across the fields of Eastern Europe. In the forests of Ukraine, in the ravines of Belarus, in the outskirts of Riga and Minsk and Vilnius, the earth had begun to betray its secrets. After months of rain and thaw, the bodies buried by the Einsatzgruppen were rising again. Villagers spoke of dogs digging at the mounds, of streams tainted by decay, of nights filled with the buzzing of flies that never seemed to die. Even the German officers noticed it. Grimaces behind gloved hands, reports written with unease. The graves were restless. The Reich had built an empire of corpses, and now the corpses were fighting their way back into daylight. By the summer of 1942, whispers of what lay beneath the soil had started to spread. Soviet reconnaissance patrols, advancing and retreating along the shifting front lines, stumbled upon mass graves. Locals talked. Rumors moved like wind. Photographs were taken, reports smuggled west. Himmler, the obsessive organizer of secrecy, understood the danger immediately. If the world saw what the Einsatzgruppen had done, if the graves were uncovered before Germany could rewrite the story, it would destroy the facade of legitimacy he had built. There could be no proof left, no witnesses, no evidence. The dead had to disappear again, this time forever. The order was cold and bureaucratic. Operation 1005. It sounded like an engineering project, which in many ways it was. Its purpose was simple: to exhume, burn, and erase the remains of the millions killed by the mobile death squads. Its method was precise: open the graves, burn the bodies on pyres made of railroad tracks, crush the bones, scatter the ashes, and level the ground. No trace, no marker, no memory. The machinery of killing was now turned inward, devouring its own evidence. The SS officers who had orchestrated the massacres became curators of erasure. They would cover the crimes as efficiently as they had committed them. Himmler placed SS Standartenführer Paul Blobel in charge. Blobel had overseen the massacre at Babi Yar, where over 30,000 Jews were murdered in 2 days. He was a man of discipline and calculation, who spoke of extermination as though it were an equation. Now he was being asked to perfect the last step in that equation: concealment. Blobel set to work with the same detached professionalism that had characterized his earlier commands. He recruited men from the police and the SS, and formed mobile cremation detachments, small, self-contained units that could travel from site to site. Their mission: to make the earth forget. The process they invented was gruesome and methodical. First, the graves had to be located, sometimes through maps, sometimes through memory, often through the stench itself. Prisoners, almost always Jewish survivors or Soviet POWs, were brought to dig. They worked silently, shovels striking the soil with dull rhythm. As they dug deeper, the air thickened. They would hit layers of clothing, bones, decomposed flesh. The sight was unbearable. Bodies fused together by decay, faces still frozen in expressions of terror. The prisoners were forbidden to look, but they could not help it. Many wept as they worked, knowing they were exhuming their own families. Once the bodies were unearthed, they were dragged out and arranged on massive pyres. Layers of corpses alternated with layers of logs and kindling, railway tracks forming the frame. Fuel was poured, flames lit, and the fire would burn for days. Thick black smoke coiled upward, visible for miles. The odor of burning flesh mingled with the smoke, a sickly sweetness that clung to the skin. Guards covered their mouths with cloth, but it didn't help. The smell penetrated everything. At night, the horizon glowed red. People in nearby villages saw it and crossed themselves, whispering that even hell could not consume so many souls at once. Blobel's men experimented constantly, trying to find the most efficient methods of destruction. They built crushing devices to pulverize bones into powder, mixed ashes with soil, scattered them into rivers and marshes. They kept records of their work, reports, diagrams, even photographs. The irony was unbearable. They were documenting the erasure of documentation. But the bureaucracy of death demanded accountability, even in annihilation. How many graves opened? How many tons of bodies burned? How many ashes scattered? Every detail was logged, signed, stamped, and filed. The Nazis were destroying evidence, while simultaneously creating new evidence of their destruction. The prisoners who did the digging were known as Sonderkommando 1005. They were chained at night, locked inside makeshift barracks near the killing fields. They slept beside the open pits they worked in, surrounded by the stench of death and the crackle of fire. They knew their fate. Once the work was done, they too would be killed. Some tried to escape. A few succeeded. Those who got away became living witnesses, describing the operation in excruciating detail after the war. One survivor remembered the way the guards joked as they smoked cigarettes beside the flames. Another recalled how the ash clung to their skin so thickly that their sweat turned gray. They worked in silence, except for the sound of shovels and the occasional weeping that could not be suppressed. Blobel himself visited many of the sites. He walked among the pyres like a foreman inspecting a factory floor, adjusting the spacing of logs, ordering more fuel, timing the burns. He believed he was serving a higher purpose, that by erasing the graves, he was preserving the purity of the Reich's legacy. His letters to superiors spoke of technical difficulties, weather conditions, fuel shortages. Never once did he mention the word bodies. The abstraction protected him. It transformed the grotesque into something administrative. To him, the operation was an engineering challenge. To the world, it would be proof that evil can be executed with efficiency and pride. By late 1943, Operation 1005 had spread across occupied Europe. From the Baltic to the Black Sea, cremation squads moved in parallel with the retreating army. Wherever the front drew near, the SS moved first, not to fight, but to erase. The air above the forests of eastern Poland was thick with ash. Fields that had been burial grounds were plowed over and seeded. In some places, the ground was mixed with lime to speed decomposition. In others, explosives were used to collapse the pits. The landscape itself was rewritten, turned into farmland, roads, and forests once more. On the surface, it looked ordinary. Beneath, it was an open wound. The psychological toll on the men involved was immense, though few would admit it. The prisoners who were forced to burn the bodies carried that memory like a curse. The SS guards and officers, hardened by years of killing, began to break down. Some drank incessantly. Others lashed out in cruelty that bordered on madness. The smell never left them. It followed them into their dreams, into their homes when they were on leave, into the quiet moments when the wind blew from the east. For some, it was the first crack in their armor of obedience. For others, it was just another detail in a war already drenched in horror. In a twisted way, the erasure gave birth to new witnesses. The fires of Operation 1005 were seen by thousands who did not understand their meaning, but never forgot the sight. Farmers, children, soldiers on leave, all saw columns of smoke rising where there should have been silence. After the war, when investigators asked what they remembered, they spoke of the smell. It was not wood, they said. It was something else. The landscape itself had memorized the crime. Trees that grew where the ashes were spread took on strange hues. Animals avoided certain clearings. Rivers where ashes were dumped ran darker for weeks. Nature, too, became a witness. Blobel continued his work even as Germany's defeat loomed. By early 1944, Soviet forces were closing in. The destruction squads were forced to retreat, leaving some sites incomplete. In their haste, they left behind tools, bones, partially burned remains. When the Red Army arrived, they found the evidence still warm. At Babi Yar, they uncovered ash mixed with charred skulls, the remnants of railway tracks twisted by fire. In Minsk, they found piles of bone fragments crushed by hand. The truth that Himmler had sought to bury now lay in the open again, blackened but undeniable. Blobel himself fled west, his work unfinished. He was captured after the war and stood trial at Nuremberg. There, he spoke of orders from above, of technical assignments. He described the pyres with the same detachment he had once used in his reports. He admitted to exhuming thousands of bodies, but claimed it was an act of sanitation. When the judges read his own documents back to him, his face remained expressionless. He was sentenced to death in 1951 and hanged, but the fire he had kindled burned long after his body was gone. Operation 1005 stands as the final chapter of the Einsatzgruppen's legacy, not the beginning of murder, but its attempted obliteration. It revealed the full circle of Nazi logic, not only the destruction of people, but the destruction of their memory, their existence, their proof of having lived. It was genocide elevated to erasure. The same hands that had pulled triggers now shoveled ashes. The same minds that had tallied bodies now counted fires. The same bureaucrats who had planned killings now organized concealment. In the end, they killed the truth itself. But the earth never fully cooperated. After the war, investigators followed the faint traces that remained: disturbed soil, local rumors, fragments of bone. Archaeologists and forensic teams unearthed the past piece by piece. In some places, they found layers of ash 6 feet deep. In others, they found teeth, coins, keys. Each artifact was a whisper from the grave. The Nazis had tried to erase everything, but in their obsession with precision, they had left records. Reports, coded telegrams, schedules, all survived in fragments. The paper trail of murder had become the evidence of guilt. The witnesses, too, endured. Those who escaped from the Sonderkommando told their stories to anyone who would listen. They spoke of the flames that reached higher than trees, of the black snow that fell for days, of the silence afterward. Their words became the conscience of history. They reminded the world that even in the face of absolute destruction, truth can survive in memory, in testimony, in the stubborn refusal of the dead to stay buried. And so, when we speak of Operation 1005, We speak not only of the final act of concealment, but of the moment when the machinery of death turned on itself. The Nazis had built an empire of annihilation and then tried to erase its footprint, believing that history could be rewritten if the evidence vanished. But history does not obey dictators. It remembers in the most inconvenient ways, in the soil, in the survivors, in the records they forgot to burn. Somewhere, beneath layers of grass and time, the ashes of those fires still mingle with the earth. When the wind rises in those forests, it carries with it traces of what was once done there. Operation 1005 failed in its ultimate goal. It did not erase the dead. It merely turned their absence into a silence so vast, so heavy, that even the centuries cannot drown it. And in that silence, one can still hear the echo of shovels striking earth, of fire crackling against bone, of the whispered prayer of a man forced to burn the evidence of his own people, murmuring into the smoke, so the world will one day know we were here. Chapter 14. The Reckoning begins. It began not with vengeance, but with disbelief. When the war finally collapsed in the spring of 1945, the world looked at the ruins of Germany and struggled to comprehend what it had inherited. The cities lay in ashes, the Wehrmacht was defeated, and the Reich that once promised 1,000 years had perished in 12. Yet beneath the rubble, beneath the silence of surrender, the truth was waiting to surface. In forests and fields, in quarries and ravines, the evidence of the Einsatzgruppen's crimes began to reappear: bones in shallow pits, charred remains in half-burned pyres, the fragments of an empire built on murder. For months, the soldiers of the Allied armies walked unknowingly over ground that was already grave. And when they finally uncovered what was hidden, the air of disbelief turned to horror. In Poland, in Ukraine, in the Baltics, the Soviets found the first evidence. They were the ones who marched eastward, through the towns that had once been emptied, through the forests where the earth still shifted after rain. They found skulls and clothing, children's shoes, and German shell casings still buried in the mud. They dug, photographed, documented. But they also saw what words could not express: the silence of a landscape that had once screamed. Soviet war correspondents wrote of the pits at Ponary and Babi Yar, describing them as oceans of the dead. But even they could not comprehend the scale. The numbers were too vast, the cruelty too deliberate. It was not random violence. It was administration. That was the first lesson the world learned about the Einsatzgruppen, that genocide could be planned with the precision of an audit. When the Allies entered Germany from the west, they, too, began to find the remnants of horror. Not just the camps, which soon became symbols of the Nazi regime's depravity, but the smaller, forgotten sites: rural police headquarters, barns converted into jails, forests that hid the bones of civilians. Each new discovery added to a mosaic of atrocity. American soldiers, hardened by years of combat, turned pale when they saw what lay inside the pits. The smell, they said, was worse than death. It was the stench of something planned. It was murder wrapped in bureaucracy, cold and deliberate. It shattered whatever illusion of war's nobility still lingered. But the greatest revelation came not from the bodies, but from the paper. The Nazis, with their obsession for order, had documented everything. Orders, telegrams, reports, all filed with precision. The Einsatzgruppen's own communiques, sent from the killing fields to Berlin, spoke in a language of administration. Action completed. Area secured. Number of persons executed: 5,126. The reports were signed, stamped, dated. They read like business memos. When Allied intelligence officers uncovered these documents, they understood the magnitude of what had been done. This was not the chaos of battle. It was policy. Murder had been itemized. The first wave of reckoning came in the form of the Nuremberg trials. In that grand courtroom, under the watchful eyes of the world, the men who had orchestrated the Reich's crimes were called to account. The trials were more than legal proceedings. They were humanity's attempt to define evil. But in those early sessions, the Einsatzgruppen were almost invisible. The focus was on the architects, the ministers, generals, and planners of conquest. The mass shootings in the East were overshadowed by the camps, whose industrial scale left a deeper scar on the collective mind. Yet a few prosecutors knew that the story of the Holocaust could not be told without the story of the Einsatzgruppen, for they were the beginning, the blueprint of annihilation. By 1947, a separate trial was convened, the Einsatzgruppen trial, one of the 12 subsequent Nuremberg proceedings. 24 men were indicted. They were not the faces of propaganda, the monsters from newsreels, but men who could have passed as ordinary bureaucrats. They wore suits, not uniforms. They spoke calmly, politely, as if discussing trade agreements. Yet their signatures appeared on orders that had erased entire towns. The courtroom smelled of ink and old paper, not blood, but the weight of what those papers represented was suffocating. The judges listened to translated testimonies from survivors, to reports of mass shootings, to the confessions of soldiers who could no longer live with their memories. The lead prosecutor, Benjamin Ferencz, was only 27 years old. He was small, soft-spoken, but his words carried the moral thunder of a generation determined to restore meaning to justice. He stood before the tribunal and declared, "These men are not being tried for killing in battle. They are being tried for murdering in cold blood, for crimes so calculated, so vast, that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored." His voice did not rise in anger. It broke in disbelief. In the silence that followed, the world heard not the rhetoric of vengeance, but the sound of truth struggling to breathe. The defendants offered explanations: obedience, fear, duty. They said they were soldiers following orders, men trapped within the hierarchy of command. Some denied knowledge altogether, claiming they had only handled logistics. Others invoked patriotism, insisting that their actions had protected Germany from chaos. A few even showed defiance, believing they would be remembered as heroes of a failed crusade. But the documents betrayed them. The reports bore their names, their initials, their precise numbers. There were no enemies in those ravines, no battles fought. There were only civilians, men, women, children. One judge leaned forward and asked the defendant quietly, "Did you ever look into their eyes?" The man hesitated, then said, "We were told not to." Testimonies from survivors tore through the courtroom like open wounds. An elderly woman described the day her village was surrounded, the sound of gunfire, the cries of children calling for their mothers. A man from Lithuania spoke of the ditch he was forced to dig, of the people buried alive beneath him. Their voices cracked, but did not falter. They spoke not for revenge, but for remembrance. Each word was an act of defiance against the erasure the Nazis had tried to complete. For the first time, the world was forced to listen. When the verdicts were announced in 1948, 14 of the 24 defendants were sentenced to death. The rest received long prison terms. Yet even in judgment, there was unease. Could justice truly measure such crimes? Could the hanging of a few men atone for the annihilation of millions? Some called it a beginning, others a symbol, but no one dared to call it enough. For every officer in the dock, dozens more had vanished into obscurity, blending back into civilian life. Some changed their names. Others found refuge in the chaos of post-war Europe. Many of the killers lived quietly for decades, unpunished, unrepentant. Still, the trials marked a turning point. For the first time, the words "crimes against humanity" entered the language of law. The world acknowledged that murder on such a scale could never again be excused as obedience. The Einsatzgruppen trials established that individuals bore responsibility for their actions, even within a system of command. That principle, the duty to refuse immoral orders, would echo through generations, shaping how future wars and atrocities were judged. Yet for all its legal weight, the reckoning was haunted by silence. The victims had no graves, their families no closure. In Eastern Europe, where the ravines still lay scattered across the countryside, people avoided speaking of them. In the Soviet Union, the narrative of the Great Patriotic War subsumed Jewish suffering into a broader story of collective heroism. Monuments were built, but the names on them were often missing. The Einsatzgruppen's victims remained faceless in stone. Their memory lived only in whispers, in the stories told by survivors to their children, in the nightmares that never ended. Meanwhile, in Germany, the confrontation with the past came slowly, painfully. In the 50s, the country was more concerned with rebuilding than remembering. Many former SS officers reintegrated into civil service, their histories buried under layers of bureaucracy. It was easier to forget. Only in the 60s, with the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, did the public once again begin to look into the mirror of its own history. By then, the Einsatzgruppen were nearly forgotten, their name replaced by the shorthand of the camps. But historians who dug deeper found the same pattern repeating itself. The same reports, the same signatures, the same cold efficiency. They realized that the camps were not an aberration. They were the continuation of what had begun with the firing squads. Decades later, when German prosecutors reopened old cases, a handful of surviving perpetrators were found. Some were frail, elderly, living quiet lives as pensioners. The images of men in their 80s being led into court, trembling and pale, provoked mixed emotions. Some pitied them. Others saw only the ghosts of their victims standing behind them. One prosecutor said, "There is no statute of limitations on memory." Another replied, "But there is on life." The question remained, how does a civilization punish evil that outlives its witnesses? In the lands where the killings took place, the earth itself became the memorial. Forests grew over the graves, villages rebuilt over the ruins. In some places, locals planted flowers. In others, they looked away. The silence of those sites was heavy, but it was not empty. On certain days, when the wind was right, the scent of damp soil carried something faint, something almost human. It was memory made physical, a reminder that the past is never truly buried. The reckoning was not only judicial but moral. For decades, theologians, philosophers, and survivors wrestled with the same question. How had ordinary men become capable of extraordinary evil? The answers were complex: obedience, ideology, fear, conformity, but none felt sufficient. The Einsatzgruppen embodied something even more terrifying: the capacity for bureaucracy to make evil normal. They had not murdered in chaos, but in order, not in passion, but in procedure. That realization shook the foundations of what humanity believed about itself. It meant that the next atrocity could come not from monsters, but from men who believed they were simply doing their jobs. In the years that followed, education and remembrance became weapons against repetition. Holocaust memorials rose in cities across the world. At Babi Yar, at Ponary, at Rumbula, plaques were placed on the ground that once swallowed thousands. The names returned, one by one, etched into stone. Schoolchildren learned what their grandparents could not bear to speak of. Museums collected the photographs that the Nazis had failed to destroy, the letters that the survivors had hidden, the fragments of bone that the earth had refused to keep secret. The truth had survived, carried by those who refused to look away. Yet even now, when time has thinned the line between past and present, the reckoning continues. Every generation must rediscover the same horror and ask the same question: how did it happen? The answer does not live in archives or trials alone. It lives in the small choices of conscience, in the moments when obedience is tested by morality. The Einsatzgruppen remind us that civilization's collapse does not begin with chaos, but with quiet, efficient compliance. In the end, justice cannot bring back the dead. It cannot restore what had been lost. But it gave the living something to hold on to, a record, a voice, a warning. When the final sentences were read, when the gallows creaked, the world did not feel triumph. It felt the weight of history pressing down, whispering that evil can organize itself, wear a uniform, fill out forms, and call it duty. The reckoning, then, was not only for the men on trial, but for all of humanity. And so, as the decades passed, the silence of the ravines became the conscience of the modern world. The earth still holds what justice could not reach. But above it, the living remember. Each time a name is read, each time a child learns what happened, the reckoning begins anew. Because justice is not a moment. It is a memory that refuses to fade, a voice that whispers from the grave, never again. Chapter 15, Shadows That Remain. The wind moves softly over the fields now. The forests that once echoed with gunfire are quiet, the earth thick with grass and time. To an untrained eye, there is nothing remarkable here, just trees, dirt, and silence. But beneath this silence lies the echo of an empire built on annihilation. The Einsatzgruppen are gone, their uniforms rotted, their rifles rusted, but their shadow remains. It lingers not only in the soil they stained, but in the questions they left behind. Questions about obedience, conscience, and the fragile limits of humanity itself. This is the story after the story, the reckoning that never truly ended, the silence that history still struggles to interpret. When the war ended, the world told itself that it had triumphed over evil. The images from Nuremberg seemed to offer closure. Men in suits judged by men in robes, a world rebuilt from the ashes of its own moral collapse. But the victory was incomplete. The Einsatzgruppen had killed nearly 2 million people, and yet only a fraction of their members were ever tried. Thousands melted back into civilian life, blending with the millions of displaced, hiding behind new names, new identities, new loyalties. Some became businessmen. Some became teachers. A few even returned to government service in the new Germany. The machinery of justice moved slowly, often reluctantly, and many simply slipped through the cracks. The world was eager to move forward. But the past is not a ghost that disappears when ignored. It is a mirror, waiting patiently for someone to look back into it. In post-war Germany, the reckoning was uneasy. The country was divided, physically, politically, psychologically. In the East, the Soviet regime used Nazi atrocities as proof of fascist evil, but it also erased the specific Jewish suffering beneath a layer of ideological rhetoric. In the West, Reconstruction took priority. There's food to produce, cities to rebuild, economies to revive. The past became an inconvenience. Teachers avoided the topic in classrooms. Neighbors who had once worn uniforms walked unchallenged through markets. Children grew up beside men who had marched through the forests of Ukraine and never spoke of it. Silence became its own form of survival. But memory, no matter how deeply buried, finds its own way back. By the 1960s, a new generation began to ask questions their parents could not answer. They demanded to know what had happened in the East, what their fathers had done, what their mothers had seen. Television broadcasts showed the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, where the meticulous banality of evil was displayed in chilling clarity. Survivors spoke openly for the first time. Their words tore open wounds that had scabbed over in denial. The Einsatzgruppen, long forgotten in the shadow of the camps, re-emerged in historical consciousness. Researchers uncovered their reports, their photographs, their field diaries. The faces of the killers looked ordinary, almost gentle, and that made them terrifying. The students who protested in Frankfurt and Berlin realized that the question was not just who these men were, but how society had made them possible. In Eastern Europe, the memory of the Einsatzgruppen never truly faded. It lingered in whispers and unmarked graves. In villages across Ukraine, farmers still unearthed bones when they plowed their fields. Children played near shallow depressions that once held hundreds of bodies. Local historians, often working in secret under communist censorship, tried to preserve what they could. They collected testimonies, marked sites with stones, wrote names in fragile notebooks. They understood that forgetting was the final victory the killers had sought. For them, remembrance was rebellion. As the decades passed, archaeologists and forensic teams began to uncover what was once meant to remain hidden. They dug carefully through layers of soil, sifting through bullets, buttons, and fragments of bone. Each discovery was small, but monumental. Every item was proof, a defiance against denial, a voice emerging from the grave. One archaeologist wrote, "The earth remembers. Even when we forget, it waits for us to ask again." Through their work, the ravines became classrooms. Babi Yar, Ponary, Rumbula. These names ceased to be whispers. They became symbols. But memory is not only a matter of history, it is a matter of conscience. The story of the Einsatzgruppen forces us to confront not just what they did, but how they became capable of doing it. They were not madmen, not aberrations. They were, in many ways, reflections of what ordinary people can become when ideology replaces empathy, when conformity overrides morality. Historians, psychologists, and theologians have all tried to explain it. Was it obedience, fear, indoctrination, or something simpler, an absence of imagination, the inability to see the other as human? The truth, perhaps, lies in the intersection of all these things. Evil rarely announces itself with horns and fire. It arrives in neat uniforms, in paperwork stamped with official seals, in words that sound like duty. In the quiet decades that followed, survivors became the last living bridges to the truth. Their voices grew softer with age, but sharper with purpose. They visited schools, spoke at memorials, sat before cameras. Some had been children during the massacres, crawling out from under the dead to find themselves alone in a world that had stopped caring. They told their stories so that the next generation would know what silence costs. They carried the weight of memory like a sacred burden. One survivor, standing at the edge of a ravine in Ukraine, once said, "The earth here is still warm. It remembers our names, even if the world does not." The Einsatzgruppen's legacy also lived on in another, darker form. The techniques and justifications they pioneered did not vanish with their defeat. Intelligence agencies, dictatorships, and extremist movements across the 20th century studied the Nazi model of control. How to depersonalize victims, how to turn ideology into law, how to mobilize bureaucracy for killing. From Latin America to Southeast Asia, echoes of the same logic appeared in new uniforms, new slogans, new languages. The forms changed, but the function remained. The belief that extermination could be rational, that certain lives could be erased in the name of order. The Einsatzgruppen had not just killed millions. They had demonstrated a system for killing itself. In the late 20th century, as Germany wrestled publicly with its past, new memorials began to rise. At Babi Yar, where for years only a vague Soviet monument stood, a new memorial was built, one that named the Jews who had died there, that acknowledged what had long been denied. In Lithuania, local volunteers restored the overgrown site of Ponary, planting trees in circles around the pits. In Belarus, children were taught to whisper prayers when they passed through the forests near Mali-Trosnitz. The act of remembrance became an act of resistance, not against an enemy, but against forgetting. But even remembrance is fragile. In some places, the ravines were paved over, turned into construction sites or roads. Developers unearthed bones and called them obstacles. In others, denial took root again, dressed in a language of skepticism. Some claimed the numbers were exaggerated, others that the crimes had been mutual. The poison of revisionism spread quietly, feeding on ignorance and fatigue. But history does not forgive ignorance, and denial does not erase evidence. The earth itself has too many witnesses. The photographs, the testimonies, the bullet casings. They speak with a clarity that cannot be undone. For historians, the study of the Einsatzgruppen became a warning as much as a record. Their story was not only about the past. It was a blueprint of collapse. It showed how modernity, with its technology and order, could be twisted into an engine of destruction. It revealed how moral responsibility dissolves in the presence of ideology, how language itself can be weaponized. Words like evacuation, special action, final solution. These were not euphemisms, but camouflage. They transformed murder into policy, horror into paperwork. It is a lesson that resonates wherever power meets fear, wherever obedience replaces thought. In the 21st century, new generations visit the sites of the massacres. They walk through the forests, stand by the markers, listen to the wind. Many weep, others fall silent. Some take photographs, some close their eyes. The air there feels different, thicker, as if the ground itself resists every step. Guides tell the stories with precision, but even the best words falter. There is no language that can truly describe what happened when the world stopped seeing people as human. And yet, telling it remains essential, because silence is the same soil in which hatred grows again. The Einsatzgruppen shadow stretches beyond history. It reaches into philosophy, ethics, and human identity. What does it mean to be civilized if civilization can produce such barbarism? What does morality mean when law and obedience are used to justify slaughter? These are not questions confined to the past. They follow us into every century, into every moment when power demands submission. They remind us that evil is not always loud or impulsive. Sometimes it is methodical, rational, polite. As the last survivors fade from living memory, their absence deepens the responsibility of those who remain. We no longer have their eyes to look into, their voices to tremble through the retelling. What we have are records, photographs, testimonies. But history without empathy becomes statistics, and statistics cannot weep. The task of remembrance is not only to know, but to feel, to let the silence of those forests echo inside us until it becomes a voice we can no longer ignore. The story of the Einsatzgruppen does not end with the trials or the memorials. It ends, or perhaps continues, in the quiet recognition that what they did is possible wherever humanity forgets its own reflection. The killers were not born different. They were molded by words, by fear, by pride, by obedience. They remind us that morality is not inherited. It must be chosen again and again, even when it costs something. Especially then. Today, the sites of their crimes are calm. Birds nest in the trees that once hid the gunfire. The rivers run clear where once they ran red. But the ground is not innocent. It holds history like a heartbeat, faint but constant. If you kneel and listen long enough, perhaps you can still hear the echo, the soft, distant hum of the machinery that once turned men into instruments, and the quieter, stubborn sound of the world remembering. The Einsatzgruppen were destroyed, their empire of death dismantled. Yet what they revealed about the human soul endures. They showed that civilization's greatest threat is not chaos but order without conscience, knowledge without compassion, obedience without question. That is their final legacy, the warning written not in words, but in silence. And so, as the wind moves over the grass and the sun sets over the quiet fields, we are left with the same question that has haunted every generation since. How do we live knowing what human beings have done to one another? There is no answer that erases it. There is only the act of remembering, of teaching, of refusing to turn away. Because the moment we forget, the shadows begin to move again. And history has already shown us how easily they can return.